Imagine, if you will, a world illuminated not by the pervasive glow of screens, but by the steadfast beam of a lighthouse. A world where the sea was a highway and a hungry beast, and the lighthouses were beacons of safety and hope. And imagine a young man named Thomas, drawn to that life, a life of solitude and service, a life quite unlike any other. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year is 1878. The Industrial Revolution is chugging along, transforming cities and churning out opportunities. But for many, life remains a struggle. For young Thomas, working long hours in a smoke-filled factory, the city offers little solace. He dreams of something more. He yearns for the open air, the vast expanse of the ocean, a purpose that transcends the endless grind. One blustery autumn evening, tucked away in a dimly lit corner of the local pub, Thomas stumbles upon a tattered newspaper. Amidst the advertisements for patent medicines and corsets, a small, unassuming notice catches his eye. Wanted assistant lighthouse keeper, must be of strong constitution, sound mind and unwavering dedication. Apply in person to the Northern Lighthouse Board, Edinburgh. The Northern Lighthouse Board. The words seemed to hum with a strange allure. Lighthouses, they were mythical and they were real. Stories of shipwrecks averted and lives saved flooded his mind. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling, a chance to contribute, to protect, to stand as a sentinel against the unforgiving sea. Without a second thought, and with a boldness that surprised even himself, Thomas resolved to apply. He knew nothing of lighthouse keeping, but he possessed the qualities the advertisement sought: a strong back, an even stronger will, and a heart that yearned for something greater than the life he currently knew. The journey to Edinburgh was arduous, a cramped and rattling affair by train, and then a bumpy stagecoach ride. The city itself was a stark contrast to his small village, a bustling hub of industry and commerce. Finding the Northern Lighthouse Board was like finding a hidden gem amid the chaos. A solid, imposing building, radiating quiet authority. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed and purposeful. Stern-faced men in dark suits bustled about, poring over maps and charts. Thomas, feeling a mixture of awe and intimidation, approached the reception desk. After stating his business, he was directed to a small, sparsely furnished office. There, behind a large oak desk, sat a man named Mr. Macmillan. He was a stout, serious-looking man, with a neatly trimmed beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to assess Thomas from head to toe in an instant. "So you're here about the lighthouse keeper position," Mr. Macmillan stated, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Have you any experience at sea?" Thomas, honest to a fault, admitted that he did not. "But I am a hard worker, sir, and I am eager to learn." Mr. Macmillan leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "Lighthouse keeping is not for the faint of heart, lad. It's a lonely life, a demanding life. You'll be isolated for weeks, sometimes months, at a time. You'll face storms that will test your very soul. Are you sure you're prepared for that?" Thomas, recalling his factory job and the longing in his heart, answered without hesitation, "Yes, sir, I am." The interview was a rigorous affair. Delving into Thomas's physical abilities, his mental fortitude, and his understanding of basic mechanics and mathematics, Mr. Macmillan seemed particularly interested in Thomas's ability to remain calm under pressure and his capacity for self-reliance. He was asked about his family, his upbringing, and his reasons for seeking such an unusual profession. To Thomas's surprise and immense relief, he was offered a place in the board's training program. It was not a guarantee of a permanent position, but it was a foot in the door, a chance to prove himself worthy. The training itself was a grueling trial by fire. It took place at a training facility located on the rugged coastline north of Edinburgh. A cluster of stone buildings stood defiant against the crashing waves, a constant reminder of the power and peril of the sea. The curriculum was comprehensive and demanding. Thomas and his fellow recruits learned the intricacies of lighthouse mechanics, how to operate and maintain the complex clockwork mechanisms that rotated the lenses, how to clean and polish the massive glass prisms that focused the light, and how to repair any damage that might occur. They were taught basic navigation, meteorology, and seamanship. They learned how to read charts, how to use a compass, and how to recognize different types of ships. They were instructed in the art of knot tying, rope handling, and signaling. Physical training was equally rigorous. The recruits were put through their paces with daily drills that tested their strength, stamina, and agility. They learned to climb the winding stairs of the lighthouse tower with ease, to carry heavy loads, and to withstand the buffeting winds and spray. One of the most challenging aspects of the training was the simulated isolation. The recruits were confined to small, austere rooms for extended periods, forced to rely on their own resources for entertainment and mental stimulation. This was designed to weed out those who could not cope with the solitude of lighthouse life. Thomas found the isolation difficult at first. He missed the company of others, the simple pleasures of conversation and camaraderie. But he gradually learned to appreciate the quiet solitude, to find solace in reading, writing, and contemplation. He discovered a hidden strength within himself, a resilience that he never knew he possessed. The instructors were a mix of seasoned lighthouse keepers and retired naval officers, men who had spent their lives at sea and knew firsthand the challenges and rewards of lighthouse duty. They were tough but fair, demanding but supportive. They instilled in the recruits a sense of pride, responsibility, and unwavering dedication to their craft. After months of intensive training, the recruits faced a final examination. This was a comprehensive assessment of their knowledge, skills, and abilities. They were tested on everything they had learned, from lighthouse mechanics to navigation to emergency procedures. Thomas, fueled by his determination and his growing love for the sea, excelled in the examination. He demonstrated a natural aptitude for the technical aspects of lighthouse keeping and a remarkable ability to remain calm and focused under pressure. He passed with flying colors, earning the respect of his instructors and the admiration of his fellow recruits. He was now a qualified assistant lighthouse keeper, ready to embark on his new life. A life of service, solitude, and unwavering dedication to the light. The sea was waiting. The salt spray stung Thomas's face, a constant reminder that he was now completely at the mercy of the sea. He gripped the railing of the supply boat, the small craft bucking and pitching with a ferocity he hadn't anticipated. Land, which had seemed so solid and reliable just hours ago, was now a hazy smudge on the horizon, fading further with each passing wave. Below deck, the crates of supplies, flour, dried beans, oil, and a few precious bundles of letters shifted ominously with every swell, threatening to crush anything or anyone in their path. He wasn't a terribly seasick man, not typically, but today felt different. He'd never been this far from the mainland before. Growing up in a small village, nestled deep within the countryside, the ocean had always been a distant rumor, a topic for sailors' tales and travel journals. Now, here he was, surrounded by its vastness, its raw, untamed power. A shiver ran down his spine, not entirely from the cold. There was a sense of insignificance. He was just one small speck against an endless canvas of water and sky. The island, at first, was barely visible. Just a dark, low-lying silhouette on the horizon, easily mistaken for a rogue wave or a trick of the light. But as the boat chugged steadily forward, the island gradually took shape, resolving itself from the mist and spray. It was smaller than he'd imagined, a jagged outcrop of rock and windswept grass, seemingly defiant against the constant battering of the waves. And then he saw it. The lighthouse, a stark white tower, impossibly tall and slender, piercing the sky like a beacon of hope. It stood sentinel against the elements, a symbol of unwavering dedication and a promise of safe passage. He felt a strange mix of awe and trepidation. This was his new home, his new responsibility. This was where he would spend the foreseeable future, tending the light, braving the storms, and battling the isolation. The boat navigated the treacherous currents surrounding the island with surprising skill, eventually pulling into a small rocky cove that served as the island's makeshift harbor. The landing was rough, a jarring collision of wood against stone, but Thomas managed to keep his footing. He stepped onto the island, his boots crunching on the gravel, and took a deep breath. The air was thick with the smell of salt, seaweed, and something else, something wild and untamed. As he stepped away from the boat and onto the island, he noticed the steep, winding path that snaked its way up to the lighthouse. It looked more like a goat trail than a road, but it was the only way up. He adjusted his sea bag, its weight suddenly feeling much heavier, and started the climb. The wind whipped around him, threatening to snatch his hat from his head. The ground was uneven and slippery, and he had to focus to keep from stumbling. Halfway up the path, he saw them, two figures standing outside the lighthouse, silhouetted against the bright sky. They watched him approach, their expressions unreadable. As he drew closer, he could make out their features. One was tall and lean, with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. He looked to be in his late 50s, perhaps early 60s, with a certain sternness etched into his face. The other was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with a stockier build and a more relaxed demeanor. He had a thick, bushy beard and a mischievous glint in his eyes. "You must be Thomas," the taller man said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I'm Silas. I'm the principal keeper here." He extended a calloused hand. Thomas shook it, feeling the man's strength. It was a firm, no-nonsense grip. "Welcome to the island," the younger man said, grinning. "I'm Finn. Welcome to your new nightmare. I mean home." He clapped Thomas on the shoulder, his touch surprisingly gentle. Silas gave Finn a disapproving look. "Don't mind him, Thomas. He has a way of putting things. He's our second assistant keeper and resident comedian." Thomas managed a weak smile. He was still feeling the effects of the boat trip, and the climb up the hill had left him breathless. But he tried to project an air of confidence. He was, after all, a qualified lighthouse keeper. "It's good to be here," he said, trying to sound more enthusiastic than he felt. "I'm ready to get to work." Silas nodded. "Good, we'll show you around." But first he paused, his gaze sweeping over Thomas. "You look like you could use a cup of tea." Finn chuckled. "Silas's tea is legendary. It can cure anything, except boredom." Silas ignored Finn's comment and led Thomas towards the lighthouse entrance. The door was heavy and reinforced, built to withstand the relentless assaults of the sea. As they stepped inside, Thomas was immediately struck by the change in atmosphere. The wind and the noise of the waves were muffled, replaced by a sense of quiet and order. The interior was surprisingly clean and well maintained. The walls were whitewashed, the floors scrubbed, and the air smelled faintly of beeswax and oil. A narrow spiral staircase wound its way up the center of the tower, disappearing into the darkness above. "This is the heart of the lighthouse," Silas said, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "This is where we live, where we work, and where we keep the light burning bright." Thomas looked around, taking it all in. This was it. His new life, a life of isolation, responsibility, and unwavering dedication. A life where the rhythm of the sea would dictate his days, and the beam of the light would be his constant companion. He had a feeling, deep down, that he was about to embark on a journey that would change him in ways he couldn't yet imagine. He looked at Silas and Finn, these two men who were now his only companions, and a flicker of hope ignited within him. Maybe, just maybe, he could make this work. Maybe he could find a purpose here. on this desolate island, guarding the light that guided ships safely through the night. And with a deep breath of salty air, he stepped forward, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. After all, he signed up for this, didn't he? Right then, let's step into the shoes, or rather, the oil-soaked boots of a lighthouse keeper in the 1800s. Forget your lattes and your streaming services for a moment, and imagine a life dictated by the rising and setting of the sun, the ebb and flow of the tide, and the rhythmic pulse of a colossal lamp. It's a world of quiet dedication, unyielding routine, and a surprising amount of elbow grease. The day, if you could call it that, often began well before dawn. Remember, the light had to be lit, and it couldn't just magically appear, now could it? First, there was the wick to trim, ensuring a steady, even burn. It was a delicate job. A tiny imbalance could lead to smoking, flickering, and a significantly weaker beam. And a weak beam, well, that's not much use when you are trying to stop ships from running aground. After the wick was dealt with, the lamp needed oil, whale oil, usually. Think about that for a second. The sheer effort of hunting whales, rendering their blubber, and transporting the oil to these remote outposts. It's a whole other story. But back to the lamp. Filling it was a messy business. The smell strong and well oily. Spills were common, and cleaning them up was just part of the routine. And then, the lens. The lens. The heart and soul of the lighthouse. Fresnel lenses, most likely. Those magnificent feats of engineering, crafted with precision and designed to focus the light into a powerful, far-reaching beam. These weren't your average magnifying glasses, no sir. They were complex arrangements of prisms and lenses, carefully positioned to maximize the light's intensity. Keeping them clean was paramount. Imagine trying to look through a dirty window, then multiply that by the importance of guiding ships through treacherous waters. Dust, salt spray, soot from the lamp, all of it conspired to cloud the lens and diminish its effectiveness. So the keepers would meticulously clean each prism, each pane of glass, with soft cloths and specialized cleaning solutions. It was a slow, painstaking process, often taking hours to complete. They'd climb ladders, reach into awkward corners, and squint in the dim light, all in the pursuit of perfect clarity. And this wasn't a once-a-week chore, mind you. This was an everyday, sometimes twice-a-day task. The elements were relentless, and the lenses demanded constant attention. Think of it like polishing a car, but a car the size of a small room, made of glass, perched on top of a tower in the middle of the ocean. Once the lens was gleaming, the light could be lit. This was often done with a simple match or taper, but it was a moment of profound responsibility. The flick of a wrist, and suddenly, the tower was alive, sending its warning beacon out across the waves. But the work didn't end there, not by a long shot. Once the light was lit, it needed constant monitoring. The keepers would take turns keeping watch, ensuring the flame burned steadily, the lens rotated smoothly, and that everything was functioning as it should. This often involved staring into the intense light for extended periods, a practice that couldn't have been good for the eyes. They would also need to monitor how efficiently the light was performing in comparison to how much fuel the lantern was consuming. Any discrepancies would need to be investigated immediately. They'd record everything, meticulously noting the time, the weather conditions, the state of the light, and any unusual occurrences in a logbook. These logbooks are fascinating historical documents, providing a glimpse into the daily lives of these isolated individuals. During the day, there were other tasks to attend to. Maintaining the lighthouse itself was a never-ending project. The constant exposure to the elements took its toll, and repairs were frequently needed. Painting, patching, fixing leaks, and replacing damaged equipment, all of it fell to the keepers. They were carpenters, plumbers, and engineers, all rolled into one. And then there was the ordering of supplies. Everything needed to be ordered well in advance, from whale oil and food to tools and clothing. Delays were common, and shortages were a constant threat. A well-stocked storehouse was essential for survival, but perhaps the most monotonous, yet vitally important, task was simply keeping watch. Day and night, the keepers would scan the horizon, looking for ships in distress, signs of bad weather, or any other potential hazards. It was a lonely vigil, often spent in silence, broken only by the sound of the waves and the creaking of the tower. Imagine standing there, hour after hour, staring out at the vast expanse of the ocean. The same view, day after day, week after week, year after year. The isolation could be crushing, and the temptation to let your mind wander must have been immense. But the keepers knew that lives depended on their vigilance. A missed signal, a delayed warning, could have catastrophic consequences, so they stayed focused, alert, and ready to respond to any emergency. They might take turns, but someone was always on watch. It was the primary responsibility, above all others. Even meal times had to be carefully orchestrated. One keeper would prepare the food, while the others maintained their watch. Simple meals, usually. Salted meat, hardtack biscuits, perhaps some vegetables if they were lucky. Food was fuel, and there was little time for culinary extravagance. And sleep? Well, sleep was a precious commodity. The keepers worked in shifts, snatching what rest they could between duties. The sound of the foghorn, the crashing waves, the constant wind, these were the lullabies of the lighthouse. So there you have it, a glimpse into the daily grind of a lighthouse keeper in the 1800s. It wasn't a glamorous life. It was often monotonous, and it was certainly demanding, but it was also a life of purpose, a life of service, and a life that played a vital role in ensuring the safety of those who sailed the sea. Life at a lighthouse. It's not exactly a party, is it? You take 3 men, often strangers to each other, cram them into a stone tower in the middle of the ocean, and expect them to function as a well-oiled machine. Easier said than done. The lighthouse, you see, isn't just a structure, it's a pressure cooker, a miniature society all its own. And like any society, it quickly develops its own pecking order, its own alliances, its own tensions. Let's talk about Thomas, our young protagonist. He's eager, conscientious, and frankly a little naive. He arrives with a head full of book learning and a heart full of romantic notions about the sea. He wants to impress, to prove himself worthy of this solitary duty, but he soon learns that theoretical knowledge and practical experience are 2 very different. Then there's Silas, a man of the sea through and through, weathered face, calloused hands, eyes that have seen too many storms. He's been at this for years, perhaps decades. The lighthouse is his life, his domain. He's a stickler for rules, a firm believer in tradition. He sees Thomas's youth and inexperience as a challenge, a threat to the established order. Silas isn't cruel, not exactly, just set in his ways, a gruff exterior hiding, perhaps, a well of loneliness, and a deep respect for the unforgiving ocean. And rounding out our trio, we have Bartholomew, often called Bart. He's the middle ground, the mediator. He's seen his fair share of storms, but he hasn't let them harden him completely. He's got a dry wit, a knack for storytelling, and a surprising amount of patience. He's the one who tries to smooth things over when Silas and Thomas inevitably clash. He might tell a joke or share a story from his youth. Bart is not necessarily the highest up in the lighthouse hierarchy, but he is possibly the most important character to overall group cohesion. The first few weeks are always the hardest. Thomas is constantly making mistakes, forgetting to polish a small section of the lens, misreading a weather chart, leaving a tool out of place. Each mistake is met with a disapproving glare from Silas, a sigh from Bart, and a wave of self-doubt from Thomas. Silas, naturally, takes it upon himself to train the new boy, but his methods are abrasive. You call that a knot, lad? A sheep could tie a better one. Or, that lens won't clean itself, boy. Get to it, and don't leave streaks. I want to see my face in it. Thomas bristles at the constant criticism. He tries to explain his reasoning, to defend his actions, but Silas just cuts him off with a wave of his hand. "No time for talk, lad. Just do it right." Bart often intervenes, pulling Thomas aside and offering gentle guidance. "Silas means well, Thomas. He just has a particular way of showing it. Pay him no mind. Here, let me show you a better way to clean the lens." Evenings are a time for shared meals and strained conversation. The small galley becomes a battleground of unspoken resentments. Silas dominates the conversation, recounting tales of past storms and daring rescues, subtly reminding Thomas of his own lack of experience. Thomas, in turn, tries to impress with his knowledge of navigation and meteorology, but his words often fall flat in the face of Silas's practical wisdom. Bart attempts to steer the conversation towards safer topics, local gossip from the mainland, stories from old newspapers, even just simple discussions about the weather, but the underlying tension always simmers beneath the surface. As time goes on, a subtle shift begins to occur. Thomas, through sheer perseverance and a willingness to learn, starts to improve. He anticipates Silas's demands, asks fewer questions and makes fewer mistakes. Silas, grudgingly, begins to respect the young man's dedication. He still finds fault, of course, but his criticisms become less frequent, less harsh. One evening, after a particularly long and arduous day, Silas actually offers Thomas a compliment. "Not bad, lad," he says, almost mumbling. "Not bad at all. It's a small thing, but for Thomas, it's a victory." The shared experiences also begin to forge a bond between the three men. They work together to repair a damaged section of the lighthouse wall, sharing the heavy lifting and the creative problem solving. They huddle together during a fierce squall, sharing stories and nervously watching the horizon. They even start to develop their own inside jokes, their own shared language. Thomas begins to see Silas not just as a gruff old sea dog, but as a man who deeply cares about the lighthouse and the safety of the ships at sea. He sees Bart not just as a mediator, but as a friend and a mentor. But the isolation, the confinement, the constant proximity, it all takes its toll. Small disagreements escalate into heated arguments. Old grudges resurface. The silence becomes deafening, broken only by the crashing waves and the rhythmic sweep of the light. One particularly stormy night, Silas and Thomas have a major falling out. A simple disagreement over the proper way to adjust the foghorn turns into a shouting match, fueled by weeks of pent-up frustration and unspoken resentments. Accusations are thrown, insults are hurled. Bart tries to intervene, but his efforts are futile. The two men are locked in a battle of wills, neither willing to back down. "You think you know everything, lad," Silas shouts, his face red with anger. "But you know nothing. You're just a landlubber playing at being a lighthouse keeper. And you're just a stubborn old man who's stuck in his ways." Thomas retorts, his voice trembling with rage. "You think you own this lighthouse, but you don't. It belongs to everyone who needs its light." The argument continues for what seems like hours, until finally, exhausted and emotionally drained, both men retreat to their separate quarters, leaving Bart to pick up the pieces. The silence that follows is heavy, suffocating. The next few days are tense. The three men barely speak to each other, each avoiding the gaze of the others. The lighthouse feels colder, more desolate than ever before. But even in the midst of this discord, the light continues to shine. The routine must be maintained. The duty must be fulfilled. Slowly, grudgingly, the men begin to work together again. They don't apologize, they don't forgive, but they find a way to coexist. Because in the end, they are bound together by something stronger than their personal differences. Their shared responsibility for the light, for the safety of the ships at sea, for the very survival of the lighthouse itself. The rhythmic pulse of the lamp, a comforting constant for months, seemed to quicken, almost nervously, as the sky began to bruise. It wasn't just the gradual darkening of twilight. This was a different kind of darkness, a heavy, pregnant darkness that pressed down on the little island, silencing the gulls and sending even the hardiest seabirds scrambling for shelter. Thomas felt it in his bones, a primal tremor of unease that resonated with the low groan of the wind, picking up off the churning water. He'd seen squalls before, passing storms that lashed the island and then vanished as quickly as they came. But this felt different. The air itself was thick with salt and anticipation, a charged atmosphere that crackled against the skin. The older keepers, Silas and Mr. Davies, moved with a quiet purpose, their faces grim. They secured the hatches, double-checked the storm shutters, and spoke in hushed tones about barometric pressure and the color of the sea, jargon that, until now, had been just words in a manual. Now they were a language of survival. The first blow came without warning, a sudden brutal gust that slammed into the lighthouse like a giant fist. The entire structure shuddered, a low guttural moan rising from its stone foundations. Thomas, perched on the winding staircase, felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated fear. He gripped the railing, his knuckles white, as the wind howled around him, a banshee's wail amplified by the tower's acoustics. "She'll hold," Silas said, his voice barely audible above the roar. He was adjusting one of the storm shutters, his weathered face set in a mask of grim determination. "She's seen worse than this." But Thomas wasn't so sure. The lighthouse, a beacon of hope and safety, suddenly felt fragile, vulnerable against the immense power of the storm. He imagined the relentless waves crashing against its base, the constant battering, the sheer force of the ocean trying to tear it from its rocky perch. As the storm intensified, the rain began, a torrential downpour that blurred the already indistinct horizon. The sea transformed into a frothing cauldron, whitecaps whipped into a frenzy, waves towering high above the island, threatening to engulf everything. Lightning flashed, illuminating the scene in stark momentary glimpses of chaos, revealing the terrifying beauty and raw power of nature. The light, their precious vital light, was now battling against the storm's ferocity, its beams struggling to penetrate the dense curtain of rain and spray. Thomas knew, with a sickening certainty, that ships out at sea were relying on that faint glimmer, trusting it to guide them through the treacherous waters. He joined Silas at the lamp, the two of them working in a tense silence. They adjusted the fuel flow, cleaned the lens, and made constant checks to ensure the mechanism was functioning properly. Every creak and groan of the structure sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. The wind buffeted the lantern room, making it sway precariously. He could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots. Hours blurred into an endless cycle of wind, rain, and fear. Sleep was out of the question. Adrenaline coursed through Thomas's veins, keeping him alert, focused. He watched mesmerized as waves crashed against the lantern room windows, sending sheets of water cascading down the inside. He saw, in one terrifying moment, the full force of the ocean, its power to destroy, its indifference to human life. Mr. Davies, ever the stoic, remained below, monitoring the lower levels for flooding and structural damage. He reported that the storm shutters on the west side had begun to buckle. The news hung heavy in the air. If the shutters failed, the waves could breach the lighthouse, potentially flooding the lower levels and extinguishing the lamp. Silas barked orders, his voice tight with urgency. Thomas grabbed a coil of rope and followed him down the winding stairs, the wind howling like a demented beast at their heels. They battled their way to the west side of the lighthouse, the rain stinging their faces, the wind threatening to rip them from their footing. The storm shutters were indeed failing, the wooden planks straining and groaning under the relentless pressure. Silas secured one end of the rope to a sturdy beam, then tossed the other end to Thomas, gesturing for him to wrap it around the most vulnerable shutter. "Pull tight," Silas yelled, his words snatched away by the wind. "Pull as tight as you can." Thomas braced himself against the wall and pulled with all his might. The rope bit into his hands, but he held on, his muscles screaming in protest. Slowly, agonizingly, the shutter creaked back into place, offering a brief reprieve from the onslaught. They repeated the process on the other shutters, working as a team, battling the storm inch by inch. It was a desperate struggle, a fight against the elements, against the very forces of nature. Thomas felt a surge of something he hadn't felt before, a fierce determination, a refusal to yield. He was a lighthouse keeper, and his duty was to protect the light, to safeguard those out at sea. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they managed to reinforce the shutters. Exhausted and soaked to the bone, they stumbled back to the lantern room, their bodies aching, their spirits battered but unbroken. The storm raged on, but the lighthouse had held. The light continued to shine, a beacon of hope in the darkness. Thomas looked at Silas, his face etched with fatigue, and saw a flicker of pride in his eyes. They had faced the storm, and they had survived. As dawn approached, the storm began to subside, the wind gradually diminishing, the rain easing. The sky, still bruised and grey, began to lighten. The sea, though still rough, lost its frenzied edge. Thomas watched as the sun finally broke through the clouds, casting a golden glow across the battered island. The lighthouse, scarred but standing, seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. He knew, with a newfound understanding, what it meant to be a lighthouse keeper. It wasn't just about maintaining the light. It was about courage, resilience, and an unwavering commitment to duty. It was about facing the darkness and refusing to be extinguished. The experience was terrifying, but he would do it again if necessary. The quiet of the lull after the storm was calming. He knew that now he truly understood the importance of his job. He understood what it meant to be a light in the dark. The days at the lighthouse settled into a rhythm, a demanding, unwavering rhythm, but a rhythm nonetheless. Sweeping, polishing, checking the oil, winding the mechanism, each task a step in a constant circling dance around the giant, gleaming eye that watched over the sea. But even in the midst of this routine, there were moments of quiet, moments of exploration perhaps. One afternoon, during a rare lull in the wind, I found myself drawn to a dusty corner of the lamp room. Behind a stack of spare wicks and a coil of thick rope, I spotted a small wooden chest. It wasn't locked, just tucked away. Curiosity, that old siren's call, tugged at me. I lifted the lid. Inside, nestled amongst faded ribbons and dried sprigs of what might have once been lavender, were several leather-bound books, logbooks. The logbooks of the previous keepers. The first one I picked up was dated 1847. The cover was worn smooth with age, the ink on the spine almost completely faded. The script inside was elegant, precise. A Mr. Silas Blackwood. I could almost picture him, quill in hand, meticulously recording the daily events. January 14th, 1847. Weather: thick fog, visibility negligible. Lamp lit at dusk, as per protocol. Spirits low. Missed my wife's birthday yesterday. The herring are not running this year. Simple entries, mundane even, but each one a tiny window into a life lived within these very walls. I flipped through the pages, each entry a brushstroke painting a portrait of a man slowly surrendering to the isolation. February 2nd, 1847. The fog persists. I swear I heard children laughing on the rocks today, but there are no ships due. Must be the gulls. The later entries became shorter, more fragmented. The elegant script devolved into a hurried scrawl. March 10th, 1847. Storm, unrelenting. The light flickered, prayed for strength. The final entry, barely legible, read simply, "The sea, it calls." Chills prickled my skin. I set that logbook aside and reached for another. This one was from the late 1860s, penned by a keeper Elias Thorne. Thorne's log was different, more practical. He was clearly a man of the sea, less prone to philosophical musings, and more concerned with the mechanics of the lighthouse. July 22nd, 1868. Repaired the west-facing window pane after storm damage. The glass was shattered. Had to use the last of the sealant. Requested more supplies from the mainland. Rations are getting thin. He wrote in detail about the tides, the currents, the migratory patterns of the birds that flock to the island. He described innovative methods for catching rainwater and preserving fish. He even sketched diagrams of modifications he'd made to the lamp's ventilation system. This was a man who had mastered his environment, who had found a purpose in the relentless routine. But even Thorne's stoicism couldn't completely mask the inherent hardships. August 15th, 1868. Still no word from the mainland. Beginning to worry about scurvy. Picked the last of the wild berries today. They are bitter, but they will have to suffice. September 5th, 1868. Found a dead whale washed up on the north shore. A blessing of sorts. The blubber will provide fuel for the lamps, and the meat, though tough, will supplement our dwindling supplies. It was a harsh existence, a constant struggle against the elements, against loneliness, against the gnawing fear of the unknown. I found a particularly poignant entry near the end of Thorne's log. October 28th, 1868. A ship passed close tonight. I saw faces at the portholes, families, laughing children. I felt a pang of something, a yearning for a life I have left behind. But then I looked up at the light, shining bright and true, and I remembered my duty. I am the sentinel, I am the guardian, and this is my post. The last logbook was the most recent, dating from the 1880s. Keeper Alistair Finch. Finch was different again, more introspective, more prone to melancholy. His entries were filled with observations about the nature of light and darkness, the fragility of life, the vastness of the ocean. He seemed haunted, somehow. May 12th, 1882. The seagulls cry all night. Their voices, they sound like lost souls. I wonder if the sea claims their memories too. He wrote about dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams filled with shadowy figures and crashing waves. He described a growing sense of unease, a feeling that he was being watched. June 3rd, 1882. I saw a face in the lamp tonight, reflected in the glass. It wasn't my own. His entries became increasingly erratic. He spoke of omens, of portents, of the lighthouse itself being a living entity. July 10th, 1882. The light, it pulses now, not with a steady rhythm, but with a frantic, desperate beat, as if it is trying to warn us of something. The final entry was scribbled in a frantic hand, almost illegible. August 1st, 1882. The sea, it's coming for me. The logbook ended there, abruptly. There were no further entries, no explanation, just that chilling, final sentence. I closed the chest, the weight of those untold stories pressing down on me. 3 men, 3 lives intertwined with this lonely tower, each facing their own demons, their own struggles, their own unique brand of isolation. The lighthouse was more than just a building. It was a repository of memories, a silent witness to the triumphs and tragedies of those who had come before. And as I walked back to my duties, I couldn't help but feel a profound sense of connection to these men, these keepers of the light. Their stories were a reminder that even in the most isolated of places, we are never truly alone. We are all part of something larger, something enduring. We are all keepers of the light, in our own way. The relentless rhythm of the lamp turning, the foghorn's mournful bellow on the rare occasion the fog rolled in thick and heavy. These were the sounds of our lives, sounds we'd almost grown to ignore. They'd become so ingrained. But the silence that fell when Elias took ill, that was a different kind of silence. A heavy silence, pregnant with worry. It started subtly, a persistent cough, a lack of appetite. Elias, usually the heartiest of us all, the one who could polish off a plate of salt pork like it was the finest delicacy, was barely touching his food. He'd chalked it up to a bit of a chill, dismissing it with a wave of his hand, and a gruff, just a touch of the grip. Lads, I'll be right as rain come morning. But morning came, and Elias was anything but right as rain. He was flushed with fever, his breathing ragged, and his usually bright eyes were clouded with pain. Now there were no doctors, no apothecaries, no one for miles and miles, just the churning sea and the cold hard stone of our lighthouse. We were on our own. Thomas, bless his youthful optimism, was all for sending a message to the mainland. The supply ship's due in a fortnight, he'd said, his voice laced with urgency. We could signal them, tell them it's an emergency. They could bring a doctor. But Old Man Hemlock, weathered and wise in the ways of the sea, shook his head. A fortnight, lad? Elias doesn't have a fortnight, and signaling for an emergency, that's for shipwrecks, for disasters at sea. A sick man, they'd be none too pleased, wasting precious resources and time. He wasn't a cruel man, Hemlock. He was simply practical. The sea demanded practicality. Sentimentality was a luxury we couldn't afford. So we became doctors, nurses, and comforters, all rolled into one. We took turns sitting with Elias, wiping his brow with cool cloth soaked in seawater. We brewed him weak tea from the few herbs we had, hoping to soothe his throat and ease his cough. We did everything we could think of, everything our mothers and grandmothers had taught us. But knowledge can only extend so far when you are completely alone. The burden of the light, of course, couldn't be ignored. With Elias incapacitated, the responsibility fell squarely on Thomas and Hemlock. The shifts doubled, the meticulous cleaning of the lens, the constant vigilance to ensure the lamp burned bright. The turning mechanism was working perfectly. The never-ending task was relentless. Every rotation of the light was a physical and mental push against fear. We were exhausted, bone-tired, but we dared not falter. A failed light could mean disaster for a passing ship, and the guilt of that, well, that was a burden none of us wanted to bear. The days blurred into one another. Thomas, young and eager, threw himself into the work with a fervor that both impressed and worried me. He'd always been a hard worker, but now there was a frantic edge to his movements, a desperate need to prove himself capable. Hemlock, on the other hand, grew quieter, his face etched with worry lines that seemed to deepen with each passing hour. He carried the weight of responsibility with a stoic resignation, but I could see the fear lurking in his eyes. During the short breaks, we would sit beside Elias's bunk, each of us silently contemplating what to do. Thomas spoke of remedies he had heard from the fishermen and tried his hand at them. It was a heartening reminder that even in such a remote place, men would work to alleviate others' suffering. Those few hours of stolen sleep were fitful, filled with the phantom sounds of Elias's labored breathing and the nagging fear that the light would fail while we slept. The isolation, which had previously been a constant companion, now felt like a suffocating presence. We were trapped, not just on the island, but in a desperate situation with no clear path to resolution. We were the only line of defense for someone we cared deeply about. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Elias's condition seemed to worsen. His breathing became shallower, his skin clammy. He tossed and turned in his bunk, mumbling incoherently. Hemlock and Thomas exchanged a look, a silent understanding passing between them. This was it. Hemlock, ever the pragmatist, began to prepare for the worst. He gathered the few personal belongings Elias had brought with him, carefully sorting them into a small wooden box. Imlock selk and toe, Imlock selk and a mosrose mauever. Thomas, his face pale and drawn, knelt beside Elias's bunk, holding his hand. He spoke softly, his words a jumble of prayers and comforting reassurances. I watched them both, feeling a deep sense of helplessness. We were men of the sea, accustomed to facing storms and battling the elements. But this was a different kind of battle, one we were ill-equipped to fight. I could only offer silent support, keeping the lamp burning and praying that Elias would somehow pull through. That night, the storm began. The winds howled, the waves crashed against the rocks, and the lighthouse groaned under the relentless assault. It felt as if the elements themselves were mirroring the turmoil within our small, isolated world. The lamp flickered precariously, threatened by the raging storm. Thomas refused to leave Elias's side, even to help Hemlock tend to the light. It was Hemlock alone, battling the storm and tending to the lamp. the responsibility weighing heavily on his shoulders. It was a long and terrifying night, one that tested our resolve to its limits. By morning the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling in the dawn light. But the peace was short-lived. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden rays into the lighthouse, we knew that Elias was nearing his end. He passed away quietly, peacefully, with Thomas holding his hand. There were no dramatic pronouncements, no tearful farewells, just a gentle sigh, and then silence. The silence of death, even more profound than the silence of illness. We buried him on the island, in a small plot overlooking the sea. Hemlock read a few words from the Bible, his voice rough with emotion. Thomas wept openly, his tears mingling with the salty spray of the waves. I stood silently, offering a prayer to the sea, asking it to watch over Elias's soul. We returned to the lighthouse, the weight of our loss heavy on our hearts. The light, of course, still needed to be tended. The ship still needed to be warned. Life, even in the face of death, had to go on. The experience changed us, hardened us in ways we hadn't anticipated. We had faced death, stared into the abyss, and emerged different. We were no longer just lighthouse keepers. We were survivors, bound together by the shared experience of loss and the enduring responsibility of keeping the light burning, a beacon of hope in the vast and unforgiving sea. The isolation no longer just a geographical one, but a deep, unspoken understanding of what we had faced and what that meant for our future. Elias's absence was a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the crushing weight of solitude and responsibility. Life on a remote lighthouse island in the 1800s wasn't exactly a trip to the corner store. We're talking about isolation that stretched on for months, punctuated only by the rhythmic crashing of waves and the relentless sweep of the light. And with that isolation came a very real problem: food. Getting supplies to these lonely outposts was a logistical challenge, a dance with unpredictable seas and the ever-present threat of storms. So how did these keepers eat? What did they eat? And how on earth did they keep it from spoiling before they could even cook it? Well, the first lifeline was the supply ship. These vessels, often infrequent visitors, were the keepers' connection to the outside world. They'd arrive laden with the essentials: barrels of salted meat, usually pork or beef, hardtack biscuits, those famously indestructible crackers that could probably survive a nuclear apocalypse, dried beans, flour, and perhaps, if the keepers were lucky, some root vegetables like potatoes or turnips. These were the staples, the culinary bedrock upon which a lighthouse keeper's diet was built. But fresh wasn't exactly a word in the lighthouse keeper's vocabulary. Everything had to be preserved, and preservation techniques in the 1800s were, let's just say, not exactly gourmet. Salting was king. Meat was packed in layers of salt, drawing out moisture and inhibiting bacterial growth. This resulted in a product that was incredibly salty, incredibly tough, and incredibly well persistent. It would last, that's for sure, but taste was a secondary concern, to put it kindly. Soaking the meat in fresh water for hours, or even overnight, was crucial to make it palatable, drawing out some of the excess salt before cooking. Then there was the hardtack. Oh, the hardtack. These biscuits were essentially flour, water, and salt, baked until they were rock solid. They were designed to withstand the rigors of long sea voyages and extended storage, and they did their job admirably. Too admirably, some might say. Hardtack was so hard that it could break your teeth if you weren't careful. The preferred method of consumption involved dunking it in coffee, tea, or even water to soften it up. This also had the added benefit of dislodging any weevils that might have taken up residence inside. Yes, weevils. These tiny insects were a common and unwelcome guest in the hardtack supply. The keepers often joked, or maybe they weren't joking, that the weevils were just extra protein. Dried beans were another dietary staple. They were cheap, nutritious, and relatively easy to store, but they required a long soaking time to rehydrate, and even then they could be, well, let's just say they weren't known for their delicate flavor. But combined with salted meat, and perhaps a few onions if they had some, they could form a hearty and filling stew, a welcome comfort on a cold, stormy night. Flour was used for baking, primarily bread, but baking on a lighthouse island presented its own challenges. Fuel was precious, so ovens were often small and inefficient, and the unpredictable weather could make it difficult to maintain a consistent temperature. Still, the keepers did their best, and a freshly baked loaf of bread was a rare and treasured treat. But relying solely on supply ships wasn't a sustainable solution. Keepers had to be resourceful to supplement their rations and introduce some variety into their monotonous diet. This meant turning to the island itself for sustenance. Many lighthouse islands were and are havens for seabirds, and seabirds meant eggs. Gathering seabird eggs was a common practice, although it wasn't without its risks. The birds themselves could be aggressive, and the terrain was often treacherous. But the reward was a valuable source of protein and fat, a welcome addition to the keeper's diet. The eggs were often pickled or preserved in brine to extend their shelf life. They might taste a little different from chicken eggs, but they were a welcome change from salted meat and hardtack. Fishing was another essential skill for a lighthouse keeper. The surrounding waters were often teeming with fish, and a skilled fisherman could supplement his rations considerably. Cod, haddock, and mackerel were common catches. The fish could be eaten fresh, of course, but more often it was salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it for later use. Smoking involved building a small fire and hanging the fish above it, allowing the smoke to slowly cure and preserve the meat. Drying involved simply hanging the fish in the sun and wind, allowing it to dehydrate. The resulting product was tough and chewy, but it could last for months. Some islands also offered opportunities for hunting. Rabbits, if present, were a valuable source of meat, and some keepers even kept chickens or goats, providing a steady supply of eggs and milk. But these animals required care and attention, and they were vulnerable to the harsh weather and predators. Gathering edible plants was another way to supplement the keeper's diet. Seaweed in particular was a readily available and nutritious resource. It could be eaten fresh, dried, or used as a thickening agent in soups and stews. Other edible plants, such as wild berries and greens, could also be found on some islands, although they were often seasonal and scarce. But perhaps the most important ingredient for a lighthouse keeper's survival was ingenuity. They had to be resourceful, adaptable, and willing to experiment. They learned to make do with what they had, to find creative solutions to problems, and to appreciate the simple things in life. A cup of coffee, a piece of bread, a fresh caught fish, these were luxuries to be savored, reminders of the world beyond the lighthouse and the comforts of home. They were also a testament to the resilience and resourcefulness of the men who kept the lights burning, day after day, night after night, in the face of isolation and hardship. And in the end, it was that spirit of resourcefulness, that ability to make do with what they had, that allowed them to not just survive but to endure. Even amidst the relentless routine, the flickering lamp, and the rhythmic crash of waves, there were moments when the veil between the ordinary and the extraordinary seemed to thin. The keepers, isolated as they were, found solace, and perhaps a little fear, in the maritime folklore that clung to the sea like sea mist. Now, Old Man Hemlock, he was a treasure trove of these tales. Been on the sea since he was barely taller than a ship's mast. He'd tell stories that sent shivers down your spine, even on the warmest summer nights. He was convinced that the sea held secrets, spirits, and grudges that stretched back to the beginning of time. One of his favorites? The tale of the phantom ship, a ghostly galleon, sails tattered and torn, crewed by the spectral remains of sailors lost at sea. Hemlock claimed to have seen it himself, gliding silently through the fog one night, its lanterns casting an eerie green glow. Said its appearance was a sure sign of impending doom, a warning that the sea was about to claim more souls. He always emphasized never acknowledging it, never calling out, Just avert your eyes and pray for it to pass. Then there was the legend of the mermaids, not the beautiful, singing creatures of children's stories, mind you. These were darker, more alluring beings. Hemlock described them as creatures with voices that could hypnotize a man, drawing him into the depths, never to be seen again. He warned against ever answering their calls, or even lingering too long near the water's edge during a full moon, when their power was at its peak. He used to say their tears are the only source of perfect pearls, but at what cost? The younger keeper, Thomas, he'd often scoff at these stories, calling them old wives' tales. But even he couldn't deny the strange feeling he'd get sometimes, staring out at the endless ocean under the cloak of night. There was something inherently unknowable about the sea, something that whispered of forces beyond human comprehension. Superstitions were rife, too. Whistling on board was strictly forbidden, as it was believed to summon the wind and bring about storms. Killing an albatross was considered the worst possible offense, guaranteed to bring bad luck to the entire crew, and likely the entire lighthouse station. Even something as simple as turning a loaf of bread upside down was frowned upon, said to invite misfortune. Hemlock was adamant about not changing your socks on the equinox, or you'd have terribly bad luck for the following season. And never ever refer to a rabbit by name aboard any vessel. These weren't just silly beliefs, though. They were survival mechanisms, born from generations of sailors who had learned to respect the unpredictable nature of the sea. They provided a sense of control in a world where control was often an illusion. By following these rules, these unspoken laws, they felt they could somehow appease the sea, or at least avoid incurring its wrath. The ever-present sound of the foghorn became a symbol of not only safety, but the dread that there was something lurking in the thick mists. One superstition, in particular, resonated deeply with the keepers: the belief that the souls of drowned sailors lingered near lighthouses, drawn to the light like moths to a flame. Some believed they were seeking guidance to the afterlife. Others that they were simply lost and confused, forever searching for a way back home. Hemlock would often leave a small glass of fresh water near the lantern room, a symbolic offering to these restless spirits. He claimed he could sometimes hear them, faint whispers carried on the wind, the mournful cries of those who had perished beneath the waves. Thomas, of course, dismissed it as the wind playing tricks on his ears, but even he admitted there were nights when the silence felt heavier, more pregnant with unseen presence. And then there were the stories of the sea serpents, not just the fanciful tales of giant monsters, but more subtle, insidious creatures that could capsize boats with a single flick of their tail, or lure sailors to their doom with their hypnotic gaze. These stories were less about literal monsters, and more about the fear of the unknown, the primal dread of what lurked beneath the surface. The idea that men were not, in fact, top of the food chain. One thing that always struck me was the universal sense of vulnerability. They were always at the mercy of forces far greater than themselves. The sea could be a source of life, of sustenance, but it could also be a cruel and unforgiving mistress. These legends and superstitions were a way of acknowledging that power, of trying to make sense of the chaos and uncertainty that surrounded them. They were about understanding their place in the world, a world where humanity was often a very small, very fragile thing against the vast, indifferent expanse of the ocean. Perhaps these stories were simply a way to pass the time during those long, lonely nights. Or maybe they were a genuine reflection of the keeper's deepest fears and beliefs. Whatever the truth, they served as a reminder of the power of the sea, its capacity for both wonder and terror, and the enduring human need to find meaning in the face of the unknown. And with that, let the ebb and flow of the sea wash over your thoughts and carry you gently into slumber. The ceaseless rhythm of the sea, the hypnotic rotation of the lens, the unchanging horizon, these are the hallmarks of a lighthouse keeper's life. But behind the stoic facade and the dutiful performance of tasks, a subtle erosion was taking place, a wearing down of the mind as profound as the battering of waves against the tower's stone. Loneliness, a constant companion, began to morph from a simple feeling of solitude into a gnawing ache, a pervasive sense of detachment from the world and everyone in it. Imagine waking up each day to the same view, the same sounds, the same routine. The rising sun, beautiful as it may be, loses its luster when it's witnessed from the same window day in and day out. The cries of the gulls, initially a charming reminder of nature, become a relentless, grating chorus. The meticulously polished lens, a symbol of hope for sailors, transforms into an instrument of unending repetition. This monotony, while necessary for the light's unwavering service, was a breeding ground for mental stagnation. The mind, starved of novelty and stimulation, began to turn inward, feeding on itself. Small irritations, personality clashes, and past grievances magnified in the echoing silence of the lighthouse. A simple disagreement over the proper way to clean the lamp chimney could quickly escalate into a simmering resentment, fueled by weeks of unspoken frustrations and the absence of any outside perspective. The keepers, often men of strong constitution and practical skills, were not immune to the psychological toll. They were, after all, human beings wired for social interaction, for variety, for the comforting presence of loved ones. Cut off from these essential needs, their mental landscapes began to shift, becoming increasingly barren and unforgiving. Consider Thomas, a young man, full of optimism and a desire for adventure. He initially embraced the solitude as a chance for reflection and self-improvement. He envisioned himself reading great works of literature, studying celestial navigation, and emerging from his time at the lighthouse a wiser, more accomplished individual. But the reality was far different. The books sat untouched on the shelf, gathering dust. The charts and instruments remained unused. The sheer weight of the daily routine, the constant vigilance required to maintain the light, and the ever-present loneliness sapped his energy and his motivation. Instead of intellectual pursuits, he found himself staring blankly at the sea for hours, his mind a swirling vortex of fragmented thoughts and unresolved anxieties. He started noticing subtle changes in himself, a growing irritability, a difficulty concentrating, a pervasive sense of unease. He found himself snapping at the other keepers over minor infractions, then retreating into sullen silence, consumed by guilt and self-reproach. Sleep became a refuge, but even then, his dreams were haunted by images of crashing waves, malfunctioning machinery, and the faces of loved ones fading into the distance. The logbook became his only confidant, a silent witness to his mounting despair. He filled its pages with increasingly introspective entries, chronicling his struggles with isolation, his fears about the future, and his longing for a life beyond the confines of the lighthouse. These entries, written in a shaky hand, were a desperate attempt to maintain a connection to his former self, to prove that he was still alive inside, despite the encroaching darkness. The other keepers, hardened by years of service, were not immune to these effects either. They developed their own coping mechanisms, some healthier than others. Some found solace in routine, clinging to the familiar tasks with almost obsessive dedication. Others retreated into silence, becoming increasingly withdrawn and unresponsive. Still others sought refuge in alcohol, finding temporary escape from the harsh realities of their lives in the bottom of a bottle. The line between sanity and madness blurred in the isolation of the lighthouse. Superstitions, fueled by loneliness and the unpredictable nature of the sea, took hold. Keepers began to see omens in the flight of birds, to hear voices in the wind, to interpret the shifting patterns of the waves as signs of impending doom. The stories of shipwrecks and ghostly apparitions passed down through generations of seafarers took on a new and unsettling significance. The mental strain was compounded by the lack of privacy. Living in such close proximity, with no escape from each other's presence, amplified any existing tensions and created new ones. Every sigh, every cough, every whispered word was scrutinized and analyzed, adding to the already overwhelming sense of anxiety. The lighthouse, intended as a beacon of safety and guidance, became a crucible of mental and emotional hardship. It tested the limits of human endurance, pushing its keepers to the brink of despair. While some succumbed to the pressures, others found a way to adapt, to find meaning and purpose in their isolated existence. But the scars of isolation remained, etched deep within their minds, a constant reminder of the psychological price they paid for keeping the light burning. And the world went on, oblivious to the silent battles fought within those lonely, wave-battered towers. The sea, often a source of quiet contemplation and predictable routine, could turn savage without warning. One autumn evening, the wind, a familiar grumble, began to howl with a malevolent intensity. The waves, which usually lapped gently against the rocks, were now monstrous walls of water, crashing against the lighthouse with terrifying force. Even seasoned keepers like Silas seemed uneasy, his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a tight-lipped silence. The beam, our steadfast guardian, cut through the storm's fury, a beacon of hope in the growing darkness. Thomas, still relatively new to this life, found a strange sense of awe mixed with dread. He'd seen storms before, of course, but never one that felt so hungry. Then, above the deafening roar, a sound pierced through, a desperate, drawn-out wail, a ship's horn, signaling distress. It was immediately cut short. Silas, his face grim, grabbed his spyglass. "Trouble," he muttered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Big trouble." Peering through his own smaller telescope, Thomas could make out the faint silhouette of a large vessel, struggling against the relentless waves. It was listing badly, tossed about like a child's toy. The horn sounded again, weaker this time, before ceasing altogether. "She's going down," Silas said, the words heavy with resignation. God have mercy on their souls. But resignation wasn't an option. They were keepers of the light, protectors of the sea, and even in the face of overwhelming odds, they had a duty. The storm raged for hours. The keepers watched helplessly as the ship was battered against the jagged rocks that ringed the island. The light, usually a comforting presence, now seemed to mock the doomed vessel. Debris began washing ashore, splintered wood, broken crates, and tragically, bodies. As dawn finally broke, painting the sky in hues of grey and blood orange, the storm began to subside, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The ship was gone, swallowed by the sea, leaving only a wreckage field as a grim reminder of its fate. Silas, despite his age, was the first to venture out. "We have to look for survivors," he declared, his voice hoarse. There might still be some clinging to life. The three keepers, roped together for safety, braved the treacherous rocks, their hearts heavy with each step. The air was thick with the smell of salt and death. The scene was horrific. Bodies were strewn amongst the wreckage. After what felt like an eternity, they found one. A young woman, barely conscious, clinging to a piece of driftwood. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Carefully, gently, they pulled her from the icy water, wrapping her in a thick blanket they brought from the lighthouse. Finding her gave them a renewed sense of purpose, a flicker of hope in the face of despair. They continued their search, pushing themselves to their limits, battling exhaustion and grief. They found two more survivors, a young boy, miraculously unharmed, and an older man, his leg badly broken. Each rescue was a small victory, a testament to their unwavering commitment. Getting them back to the lighthouse was a struggle. The rocks were slippery, the waves still unpredictable, but the keepers persevered, driven by a fierce determination to save these lives. Back at the lighthouse, they tended to the survivors, providing warmth, food, and comfort. The woman, whose name was Amelia, was inconsolable, weeping for her lost family. The boy, Thomas, another Thomas, was silent, his eyes fixed on the raging sea. The older man, a ship's carpenter named Samuel, spoke little, his face etched with pain. The keepers did what they could, offering words of solace and practical assistance. They shared their meager rations, cleaned wounds, and tried to provide a semblance of normalcy in the face of unimaginable tragedy. But the storm had taken its toll, not just on the ship and its passengers, but on the keepers as well. The horror of what they had witnessed, the helplessness they had felt, left a deep scar. Thomas, in particular, was deeply affected. He had come to the lighthouse, seeking a quiet life, a simple existence, but the sea, in its cruel indifference, had shown him the true face of mortality. The rescue efforts took a heavy toll. The keepers were physically exhausted and emotionally drained, but they kept going. Silas, despite his age, seemed to find a new wellspring of strength. He had seen shipwrecks before, he explained, but this was the worst. He knew what it was like to lose everything to the sea, and he was determined to prevent it from happening again. As the days passed, the survivors slowly began to heal, both physically and emotionally. Amelia started to help with chores around the lighthouse, finding solace in the routine. Young Thomas began to explore the island, his curiosity slowly overcoming his fear. Samuel, with the help of the keepers, began to mend his broken leg. The lighthouse, usually a place of solitude and isolation, became a haven for those who had lost everything. The keepers, once just guardians of the light, became caregivers, counselors, and friends. The experience changed them all. It strengthened their bond, deepened their understanding of the sea, and reminded them of the fragility of life. But it also left them with a profound sense of sadness, a haunting reminder of the lives that were lost and the power of the sea to both give and take away. The wreck served as a constant reminder of the dangers they faced and the immense responsibility they carried. The beam from the lamp was no longer just a light to guide ships. It was a symbol of hope for those at sea and a promise that someone was watching, ready to help when needed. The light, they now knew, was more important than ever, and they would keep it burning, no matter what. All right, settle in, friends. Let's talk about something that might seem small, but it loomed large in the lives of lighthouse keepers: communication, or rather the distinct lack thereof. Imagine being stuck on a rock, sometimes for months on end, with only two other souls for company. The world outside, the world you knew before, fades into a distant memory. News, that constant stream of information we take for granted today, became a precious, infrequent commodity. Communication with the mainland in the 1800s wasn't exactly what you'd call reliable. We didn't have phones, of course, no internet, definitely no carrier pigeons with tiny little smartphones strapped to their legs. What we did have were a few, rather limited options, and each came with its own set of problems. The primary method was the supply ship. These vessels, often contracted by the Lighthouse Board, were supposed to visit regularly, bringing vital provisions, food, oil for the lamp, fresh water when possible, and of course any mail or official correspondence, supposed to being the operative words. The sea, as we know, is a fickle mistress. Storms, fog, or simply a delayed schedule could mean weeks, sometimes even months, of isolation stretching on longer than anticipated. Think about that for a moment. You're relying on a single ship, battling unpredictable weather to connect you to everything you hold dear. A letter from your wife, a confirmation that your family is safe, maybe just a simple update about the happenings in your hometown. All of it contingent on the wind and the waves. And when the supply ship did arrive, it was often a chaotic affair. The crew would be rushing to unload supplies, the keepers eager to grab their mail, and the captain trying to stick to a tight schedule. There wasn't much time for leisurely chats or detailed news updates. You might get a brief summary of major events, but the finer details, the personal stories, those were often lost in the shuffle. Another method, though far less consistent, was signaling. If a ship passed close enough, keepers could attempt to communicate using flags or signal lamps. Specific flag combinations had pre-arranged meanings, like requesting assistance or reporting damage to the lighthouse. But again, this relied on perfect conditions, clear visibility, a passing ship that knew the signaling codes, and a crew willing to take the time to decipher the message. Imagine frantically waving a flag, hoping someone on the horizon can understand your plea, knowing that a misinterpretation could have dire consequences. It was a stressful and often frustrating exercise, and most of the time, ships simply passed by, oblivious to the silent messages being sent from the lonely tower. Sometimes, keepers might be able to send messages with passing fishing boats or small trading vessels. This was even more unreliable, as these boats weren't on any fixed schedule and might not be heading in the direction you needed. Plus, entrusting a personal letter to a random fisherman came with its own risks. Would he actually deliver it? Would he even remember? Now, let's consider the impact of this delayed and unreliable communication. It wasn't just about missing the latest gossip or being out of touch with current events. The real impact was on the keeper's mental and emotional well-being. Imagine receiving a letter that's weeks, even months old. News that might have been relevant weeks ago is now outdated, almost irrelevant. You might read about a celebration that's long past, a birth you couldn't attend, or perhaps even worse, a tragedy that you're only just learning about, with no ability to offer immediate support or comfort. This delay created a strange sense of detachment. The world you knew was moving on without you, and you were left stranded in the past, processing events long after they had occurred. It could lead to feelings of helplessness, anxiety, and even a sense of being forgotten, and the lack of timely information could have serious consequences. If a family member was ill, a keeper might be left agonizing, wondering about their condition, with no way to know if they were recovering, or worse. The uncertainty could be excruciating, a constant weight on their mind, making it difficult to focus on their duties. Moreover, the isolation could breed a sense of paranoia. Without regular contact with the outside world, rumors and anxieties could fester. Keepers might start to imagine the worst, concocting scenarios based on incomplete information or simply their own fears. A simple delay in the supply ship's arrival could quickly escalate into a belief that something terrible had happened, either to their families or to the ship itself. The limited communication also impacted the keepers' sense of identity. They were in essence removed from their social network, their community, their sense of belonging. Over time, this could lead to feelings of alienation and a weakening of their ties to the world outside the lighthouse. The letters they did receive became incredibly important, not just for the information they contained, but as a lifeline to their former lives. Keepers would often reread letters countless times, poring over every word, every detail, trying to recapture the feeling of connection and belonging. These letters were treasured possessions, tangible reminders that they were not entirely forgotten, and the letters they wrote back were equally important. They were a way to maintain those connections, to share their experiences, and to reassure their loved ones that they were safe and well. Writing letters became a ritual, a way to combat the isolation and maintain a sense of normalcy in a very abnormal situation. So you see, communication in the 1800s, or the lack of it, was more than just a logistical challenge for lighthouse keepers. It was a psychological burden, a constant reminder of their isolation, and a powerful force that shaped their experiences on those lonely, windswept towers. It highlights just how much we rely on instant communication today, and how profoundly its absence can affect our lives. Just something to consider as you drift off tonight. The isolation wasn't just physical, was it? It seeped into your bones, settled into your mind. It amplified the distance between you and everything you loved. The mainland might as well have been another planet, and for Thomas, that planet held Eliza. We found a letter amongst his belongings, tucked away in a small wooden chest. The ink is faded, the handwriting delicate but firm. It offers a glimpse into the heart of a man wrestling with the sea, with loneliness, and with a love that stretched across miles of unforgiving ocean. My dearest Eliza, another fortnight has passed, and the rhythm of the waves remains my constant companion. I find myself counting the days, the weeks, the months, until I might once again breathe the same air as you, until I might once again see the light in your eyes that guides me even now, through the darkest of nights. Life here continues much as it always has. The lamp demands its constant care, a watchful eye to ensure its unwavering beam cuts through the fog and the storm. The work itself, its honest work, noble even. But God, Eliza, it can be tedious. The endless repetition, the unchanging horizon. Sometimes I fear my mind will become as barren as this rock we call home. I try to picture you, to conjure the scent of your lavender soap, the sound of your laughter. These memories are my treasures, the jewels I hold tight against the encroaching darkness. I imagine you walking through the market, perhaps choosing a new ribbon for your hair, or attending church with your mother. Are you well, my love? Are you happy? These are the questions that haunt me in the long hours of the night watch. Mr. Davies, one of my fellow keepers, received news from the mainland. His sister has taken ill. It's a stark reminder of our helplessness here. We are so far removed from the world, unable to offer comfort or aid to those we love. This is perhaps the hardest burden of all. To be a silent observer, separated by distance and circumstance, powerless to intervene. I confess, Eliza, there are times when I question my decision to take this post. The loneliness is a heavy cloak, and the constant presence of the sea, while beautiful in its own way, is also a constant reminder of its power, its indifference. I see ships swallowed whole by storms, their cries for help lost in the wind. It makes me think of my own mortality, of the fragility of life, and of the preciousness of our time together. But then I remember your face, your unwavering belief in me. I remember the dreams we shared, the life we planned together. And I know that this hardship is temporary, a sacrifice we make for a brighter future. I will save every penny I earn, Eliza. I promise you. I will work tirelessly, endure this isolation, so that we can build a life together. A life filled with love and laughter and warmth. A life far away from this lonely rock. Sometimes I catch myself staring out at the horizon, searching for a sign, a glimpse of your ship on the horizon. I know it's foolish, a childish fantasy, but the hope, however faint, keeps me going. It's the fuel that keeps the lamp burning, the anchor that keeps my soul from drifting away. I've started carving small birds from driftwood. They are clumsy, imperfect things, but I imagine them carrying my love across the sea to you. Perhaps one day, I'll send you a whole flock. For now I keep them here, small wooden messengers of my affection, silent witnesses to my longing. Eliza, I worry. I worry about the future, about the things I cannot control. I worry about you, about your Hefelt, about your happiness. I worry that I am asking too much of you, that I am selfishly keeping you waiting. Please, write to me soon. Your letters are my lifeline, the only tangible connection I have to the world beyond this island. Knowing you are thinking of me, that you are waiting for me, gives me the strength to face another day. I pray for the day when I can leave this place behind, when I can hold you in my arms again, and never let you go. Until then, know that you are always in my thoughts, always in my heart. You are my light, Eliza, my guiding star in this vast and lonely ocean. With all my love and devotion, your Thomas, a poignant testament to the strength of human connection in the face of overwhelming isolation. His words paint a vivid picture of the emotional toll exacted by this lonely profession, a stark contrast to the unwavering dedication required to keep the light burning. It's a reminder that behind every beam of light, there was a human heart, yearning for connection, for love, and for a future beyond the horizon. The rhythmic pulse of the foghorn, a constant companion in our isolated world, was momentarily silenced. A different, more welcome sound pierced the misty air, the distant chug of a steam engine, a supply ship. After what felt like an eternity, a link to the mainland, a floating lifeline in our sea of solitude. Weeks bled into months, marked only by the turning of the lamp, the changing tides, and the dwindling supplies. The outside world, with its bustling cities and everyday chatter, had become a distant memory, a faded photograph in our minds. So the arrival of the supply ship wasn't just a practical necessity, it was a vital injection of reality, a reminder that we hadn't been completely forgotten. We scrambled down the winding stairs of the lighthouse, a mix of anticipation and nervous energy filling the air. Even old Silas, usually stoic and reserved, had a spring in his step. He muttered something about needing a fresh pipe tobacco, but I saw the flicker of excitement in his eyes. The familiar silhouette of the HMS Deliverance grew larger as it approached the island's small rocky harbour, the air filled with the smells of coal smoke and salt water, a welcome change from the ever-present scent of brine and lamp oil. We busied ourselves preparing for the arrival, securing ropes and clearing the landing area. The ship's horn bellowed, a triumphant sound that echoed across the waves. A small launch was lowered, carrying Captain Davies, a man we knew well from previous visits, and a handful of sailors laden with supplies. Captain Davies was a stout, red-faced man with a booming laugh and a seemingly endless supply of stories. He was our link to the world, our messenger, our temporary savior from the crushing weight of isolation. "Ahoy, lads," he bellowed, his voice carrying over the crashing waves. "Good to see the light still shining bright." The unloading began, a flurry of activity that broke the monotonous rhythm of our days. Crates of provisions, barrels of oil, and sacks of coal were hauled ashore, each one a treasure in our eyes. Fresh vegetables, jars of preserves, and even a small sack of apples, luxuries we hadn't tasted in months, were carefully stacked in the storage room. But the supplies were only part of the welcome delivery. Captain Davies always brought news, snippets of information that painted a picture of the world beyond our island prison. He spoke of political squabbles, scientific advancements, and the everyday dramas of ordinary people. This time, he had particularly interesting news. Apparently, the railway was extending further north, bringing the promise of faster travel and increased trade. He also mentioned rumors of a new type of lamp being developed, one that promised to be brighter and more efficient than our current model. It was all fascinating, even the mundane details. And Captain Davies said, lowering his voice conspiratorially, "I brought you something special this time, lads. Something to break the monotony." He winked and gestured to one of the sailors, who produced a crate containing several bottles of rum. A collective cheer went up. Rum was a rare treat, a luxury we savoured on special occasions. It was more than just a drink. It was a symbol of camaraderie, a temporary escape from our isolation. As the unloading continued, Captain Davies pulled me aside. "I have something for you, Thomas," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. He produced a letter, its paper slightly crumpled but undeniably precious. My heart leaped. A letter from home, from Eliza. I hadn't heard from her in months, and the uncertainty had been gnawing at me. My hands trembled as I took the letter, my mind racing with anticipation and a touch of fear. "Take your time, lad," Captain Davies said kindly, patting me on the shoulder. "Read it in peace." I retreated to my small room at the top of the lighthouse, my heart pounding with each step. The letter was addressed in Eliza's familiar handwriting, a sight that brought a wave of emotion washing over me. I carefully unfolded the letter, the scent of lavender faintly wafting from the paper. Eliza's words filled the page, telling tales of her life back home. She wrote of her work as a seamstress, the local gossip, and her unwavering love for me. She also shared some sad news. Her grandmother had passed away. Reading Eliza's words was like being transported back home, if only for a fleeting moment. It was a reminder of what I was missing, but also a reassurance that I hadn't been forgotten. The letter was a lifeline, a tangible connection to the world I longed to return to. The visit from the HMS Deliverance was a welcome interruption, a breath of fresh air in our isolated existence. But it was also a bittersweet reminder of the life we had left behind, the lives we were missing. As the ship prepared to depart, we gathered on the shore to bid farewell to Captain Davies and his crew. "Take care, lads," Captain Davies shouted as the launch pulled away, "and keep that light shining bright." We watched as the ship disappeared into the mist, the sound of its engine fading into the distance. The silence returned, heavier now, punctuated only by the crashing waves and the mournful cry of the gulls. The HMS Deliverance had brought us supplies, news, and a temporary respite from our isolation, but it had also left us with a renewed sense of longing, a deeper understanding of the sacrifices we were making. We returned to the lighthouse, carrying our burdens, both physical and emotional. The light still needed to be tended, the logbook still needed to be filled, and the watch still needed to be kept. Our lives for the moment returned to their predictable rhythm, but something had changed. The news from the mainland, Eliza's letter, the taste of fresh apples, these small things had rekindled a spark within us, a reminder of the world beyond our island prison. And as I climbed the stairs to resume my watch, I knew that the memory of this visit would sustain us through the long, lonely months ahead. The light still shone, but perhaps, just perhaps, it shone a little brighter that night. All right, settle in folks, because after weathering one heck of a storm, our boys are gonna have to roll up their sleeves and get to work. You see, lighthouses, as sturdy as they may seem, are constantly battling the elements. Wind, rain, waves, they all take their toll, especially during a proper gale. So after days of howling winds and waves crashing against the tower, it's time to assess the damage and get to fixing. Now, the first thing Thomas and the others would do, once the weather calmed, was a thorough inspection. Starting from the top, they'd check the lantern room. This was the most crucial part of the whole operation, and even the slightest crack or leak could be disastrous. Imagine the salt spray seeping in, fogging up the lens, or worse, corroding the delicate mechanism that kept the light turning. Nope, that wasn't an option. They'd be looking for cracks in the glass panes, any signs of water damage around the frame, and making sure the rotating mechanism was still running smoothly. Remember, these lenses were incredibly heavy and complex, often built with hundreds of individual prisms. If the storm had knocked something out of alignment, it would take some serious muscle and know-how to get it back on track. And of course, the lamps themselves needed to be checked and cleaned, the oil reservoirs refilled, and the wicks trimmed perfectly to ensure a bright, steady beam. Think of it as the ultimate spring cleaning, but with significantly higher stakes. Next, they'd have to check the tower itself. This meant scaling down the outside, carefully examining the stonework for any cracks or loose mortar. Years and years of exposure to salt water and fierce winds could weaken the structure, and even small cracks could eventually lead to bigger problems. It's like a cavity in a tooth. Ignore it, and you'll be sorry. They would use long ropes and harnesses, and probably a good dose of courage, to inspect every nook and cranny. And inside, well, inside they'd be checking for dampness, leaks, and any structural damage to the stairwell. Those spiral staircases, winding all the way up the tower, were a marvel of engineering, but they also needed regular maintenance. Imagine climbing hundreds of steps every day, sometimes multiple times, on a staircase that was slowly crumbling beneath your feet. Not a pleasant thought, is it? One of the most common problems, I imagine, would have been damage to the external rendering, the protective layer applied to the outside of the stone. Salt water is incredibly corrosive, and over time it could eat away at the rendering, exposing the stone beneath. This meant that the keepers would have to patch up the damaged areas, using a mixture of lime, sand and water to create a new protective layer. It wasn't easy work. It was messy, physically demanding, and required a certain amount of skill to get it right. Of course, all of this required tools and materials: lime, sand, cement, buckets, trowels, chisels, hammers. The list goes on. And remember, these were the 1800s, so they didn't have power tools or fancy equipment. Everything had to be done by hand, using the same basic tools that stonemasons had been using for centuries. But perhaps the biggest challenge was the location. They were isolated on a remote island, far from any town or village. This meant that they had to be incredibly resourceful and self-sufficient. If they ran out of a particular material, they couldn't just pop down to the hardware store to pick up more. They had to improvise, using whatever they had available. Maybe they'd crush seashells to create lime, or scavenge driftwood to build scaffolding. They were masters of making do, those lighthouse keepers. And it wasn't just about repairing the physical structure of the lighthouse. The storm could also damage the other buildings on the island, like the keepers' cottages or the boathouse. These buildings were essential for their comfort and survival, so they had to be repaired as quickly as possible. Imagine trying to sleep in a cottage with a leaky roof or a broken window during a storm. Not exactly conducive to a good night's rest. The repairs weren't always simple, either. Sometimes they would have to deal with serious structural damage, requiring them to use their ingenuity and problem-solving skills to come up with creative solutions. Maybe they'd have to reinforce a wall with timbers, or rebuild a section of the roof that had been blown away. It was like a giant puzzle, and they had to figure out how to put all the pieces back together. And let's not forget the physical toll all of this took on the keepers. They were constantly exposed to the elements, climbing, lifting and hammering in all kinds of weather. Their hands would be raw and blistered, their muscles aching, and their bodies exhausted. But they kept going, driven by a sense of duty and a commitment to keeping the light shining. It's easy to romanticize the life of a lighthouse keeper, imagining them as solitary figures gazing out at the sea. But the reality was often much more demanding and challenging. They were skilled tradesmen, engineers, and problem solvers, all rolled into one, and their ability to repair and maintain the lighthouse, often in the face of incredible adversity, was essential for ensuring the safety of ships at sea. So the next time you see a lighthouse, take a moment to appreciate the hard work and dedication of the keepers who kept it shining through fair weather and foul. They were true heroes of the sea, and they deserved a nice long nap when they were finished. Goodness, they did. The rhythm of life on the island, once so predictable, was about to be disrupted. Old Man Hemlock, as we affectionately called him, though never to his face, of course, had finally put in for his retirement. Decades he'd spent tending the lamp, weathering storms, and sharing stories older than the stone the lighthouse was built upon. He'd seen things, Hemlock had. Things he only hinted at after a shared pipe in the lantern room. Things that made young Thomas and even seasoned Finnegan shiver in the salty air. His leaving felt like a piece of the lighthouse itself was crumbling. The silence his absence would create was almost deafening to imagine. He wasn't much for grand farewells, Hemlock. Just a gruff handshake, a knowing nod, and a final sweeping gaze over the lamp, as if imprinting its brilliance on his memory forever. The supply ship that took Hemlock away brought with it not just the usual provisions and news, but a replacement, a fresh-faced lad named Alistair. Alistair was barely out of his training, green as seaweed washed ashore, and full of wide-eyed wonder at the very idea of lighthouse keeping. He'd never been further than a day's ride from London. Finnegan and I exchanged a look as Alistair stepped off the boat, clutching a small battered suitcase like it held all his worldly possessions. There was a certain naivety about him, an innocence that felt strangely out of place amidst the weathered stone and the relentless sea. "Welcome aboard, son," Finnegan said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm Finnegan, and this here is Thomas." Alistair beamed, his enthusiasm almost painful to witness. "It's an honor, sir. I've read all about you keepers. The dedication, the bravery." "Dedication, yes," Finnegan grunted. "Bravery comes with the territory. Now, let's get you settled in. Your bunk is next to Thomas's, on the 3rd floor. Try not to snore." Alistair's initial excitement, while appreciated, quickly became tiring. He peppered us with questions, endless questions about the light, the mechanisms, the weather patterns, the seabirds. He seemed to expect romantic tales of heroic rescues and thrilling adventures. The reality, as we knew, was far more mundane. Cleaning the lens for hours, battling rust, writing logs, that was the true lighthouse keeper life. So Alistair asked, after his first night, wide awake with what was certainly seasickness, "What's the most exciting thing that's ever happened here?" Finnegan, stirring his tea, simply raised an eyebrow. "The most exciting thing, son. Probably when the baker remembered to put salt in the bread." Alistair looked crestfallen. The disruption wasn't just in Alistair's constant questioning, it was in the subtle shift in our routines. Finnegan, normally taciturn and set in his ways, found himself explaining things he hadn't needed to articulate in years. I, in turn, was tasked with showing Alistair the basics, how to properly polish the lens without scratching it, a lesson learned the hard way, how to maintain the oil lamps, how to read the weather charts. It was like having a child constantly underfoot. Every task took longer, every chore required explanation. The quiet, almost meditative rhythm we'd established was replaced by a constant barrage of questions and clumsy attempts at helping. One afternoon, Alistair, eager to prove his worth, decided to clean the foghorn. He managed to dismantle a crucial part of the mechanism, leaving us scrambling to reassemble it before the evening mist rolled in. Finnegan, usually a man of few words, unleashed a torrent of frustrated grumbles that made Alistair shrink back in fear. "Lad, you need to learn to observe before you act. This ain't no tinker toy you're playing with. This is a matter of life and death for those at sea." Alistair, visibly shaken, mumbled an apology. "I just wanted to help." Helping, Finnegan sighed, requires knowing what you're doing. For now, stick to sweeping the floors. The tension in the lighthouse was palpable. Alistair, deflated and uncertain, hovered around us like a lost seabird. Finnegan, his patience wearing thin, grew increasingly curt. I found myself caught in the middle, trying to mediate between the old guard and the new recruit. I tried to explain to Alistair the realities of lighthouse life. "It's not about adventure, Alistair," I said one evening, as we sat in the lantern room, the beam sweeping across the dark sea. "It's about reliability. It's about keeping the light burning, no matter what. It's about knowing your duty and doing it, day in, day out." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I understand," he said, but I wasn't sure he truly did. The problem, I realized, wasn't just Alistair's inexperience. It was the stark contrast between his expectations and the reality of our isolated existence. He'd come here seeking adventure, seeking a heroic purpose. What he found was routine, monotony, and a constant battle against the elements. And the sea, she is a harsh mistress. She cares not for hopes and dreams, nor pretty fantasies. She rewards only commitment, and she'll test it every single night with nothing but her dark, cold face. The change in our dynamic was undeniable. Hemlock's absence created a void, and Alistair's arrival, while well-intentioned, only served to highlight it. We were no longer a well-oiled machine, working in perfect harmony. We were a disrupted system, struggling to find its balance once more. It would take time, I knew, for Alistair to adapt, time for him to learn the ropes, to understand the true nature of his duty. And it would take patience from Finnegan and me, patience to guide him, to teach him, to help him become a true lighthouse keeper. We just hoped he had the grit for it, the inner strength to weather the storms, both literal and figurative, that lay ahead. Because out here, with nothing but the sea and the sky, a man's true character is laid bare. All right, settle in, folks, because lighthouse life, as we've been saying, it's anything but predictable. We've seen how Thomas has adapted, how he's learned the ropes, from the seemingly endless polishing of that magnificent lens to braving storms that threaten to swallow the island whole. But what happens when the carefully crafted routine, that little bubble of order they've built out there, gets, well, popped? What happens when a new face arrives, green as seaweed and twice as unsure? It's a shake-up, that's what it is, a proper island-sized shake-up. You see, the rhythm of a lighthouse is a delicate thing. It's a waltz danced by two, maybe three, souls, each knowing the steps so well they could perform them blindfolded. Every task, every watch, every meal even, falls into a pattern, a comforting predictability that combats the loneliness and the relentless monotony. And bringing in someone new, it's like throwing a rogue wave into a perfectly still pond. Now, the day the supply ship puffed its way into view, it wasn't just carrying the usual flour and lamp oil, it was also carrying young, let's call him poor Peter, fresh out of training, eyes wide, with a mixture of awe and terror. Peter was the replacement for old Silas, who, bless his heart, had finally earned his retirement to a little cottage on the mainland. Silas, with his gruff exterior and secretly kind heart, had been a fixture. His departure left a Silas-shaped hole, and Peter was meant to fill it. Only Peter wasn't Silas, not even close. The first thing that struck Thomas, as Peter awkwardly clambered off the supply boat, was the sheer youth of the lad. He looked barely old enough to shave, let alone tend a vital navigational beacon. Thomas exchanged a weary glance with the senior keeper, a man named Davies, whose face could curdle milk with a single look. Davies just sighed, a long, drawn-out sigh that spoke volumes about disrupted peace and impending headaches. "Right," Davies grumbled, his voice raspy from years of sea air and taciturn pronouncements. "Let's get this over with." And so began the process of integration, or, more accurately, the process of patiently and repeatedly explaining things to someone who looked like he was constantly on the verge of throwing up, either from seasickness or sheer overwhelm. The carefully choreographed routine of the lighthouse was about to be put to the ultimate test. The initial days were chaotic. Peter, bless him, tried. He really did, but everything he did seemed to require twice as much effort and resulted in half the outcome. He fumbled with the lamp wicks, nearly dropping one into the oil reservoir, a disaster narrowly averted by Thomas's quick reflexes. He struggled to clean the lens, leaving streaks that would have made a seagull blush, and his attempts at keeping watch involved him either staring blankly into the distance or jumping at shadows like a startled rabbit. The biggest challenge, though, was the disruption to the routine. Everything took longer. Simple tasks now required detailed instructions and constant supervision. Thomas and Davies found themselves having to double back, checking Peter's work, redoing things he'd already finished. The carefully planned schedule fell apart, replaced by a constant state of firefighting. "He's like a newborn calf, trying to walk on ice," Davies muttered one evening, as they sat huddled around the small table, trying to salvage what was left of their evening meal. Thomas, despite the added workload, felt a pang of sympathy for Peter. He remembered his own early days, the confusion, the fear, the overwhelming sense of inadequacy. He knew what it was like to feel completely out of your depth, surrounded by experienced men who seemed to possess an almost mystical understanding of the lighthouse and the sea. "He'll learn," Thomas said, more to reassure himself than Davies. "He just needs time." Davies snorted. "Time is one thing we've got plenty of. Patience, on the other hand. But time, as they say, marches on, whether you're ready for it or not." And so, Thomas and Davies embarked on a crash course in lighthouse keeping 101, specifically tailored for one utterly bewildered young man. They broke down every task into its simplest components, explaining each step slowly and carefully. They demonstrated, they corrected, they encouraged. They became, in essence, teachers, mentors, and very, very patient babysitters. Thomas, surprisingly, found that he enjoyed the teaching aspect, explaining the intricacies of the lens, the delicate balance of the lamp, the importance of precise record keeping. It forced him to think about things he had previously taken for granted. It solidified his own understanding and appreciation for the vital role they played. Davies, on the other hand, remained skeptical. He viewed Peter's incompetence as a personal affront, a disruption to his well-ordered world. He offered criticism freely and sparingly with praise. But even Davies, beneath his gruff exterior, couldn't deny that Peter was trying. And slowly, ever so slowly, Peter began to improve. He still made mistakes, of course. He still required constant supervision. But the streaks on the lens became fainter, the wicks burned a little brighter, and the jumps at shadows became less frequent. He even managed to brew a pot of coffee that was actually drinkable, a milestone that was quietly celebrated with a shared nod between Thomas and Davies. The routine, though still disrupted, began to find a new rhythm, a new equilibrium. Thomas and Davies learned to anticipate Peter's mistakes, to intervene before they became disasters. They learned to delegate tasks based on his strengths, which admittedly were few, but they were there. And they learned to accept that things would simply take longer, that the smooth efficiency they had once enjoyed was now a distant memory. The arrival of Peter hadn't just changed the routine of the lighthouse, it had changed Thomas and Davies as well. Thomas had discovered a knack for teaching and a newfound appreciation for his own skills. Davies, begrudgingly, had learned the value of patience, or at least the illusion of it. And Peter, hopefully, was on his way to becoming a competent lighthouse keeper, one faltering step at a time. The light, after all, still had to shine. The rhythm of life at the lighthouse, so predictable, so unyielding, was designed in a way to keep despair at bay. The turning of the lens, the polishing of the glass, the endless watch, it was a shield against the vast emptiness that surrounded them. But even the most diligent routine couldn't hold back the tide of grief. News, when it finally arrived, traveled slow, like a weary seabird battling a headwind. Weeks, sometimes months, after an event, a letter, tattered and worn, would arrive with the supply ship, carrying tidings of joy, or, as was more often the case, sorrow. It was a grey morning, the kind where the sky seemed to press down on the island, suffocating everything. The supply ship, a welcome splash of colour against the monochrome horizon, had come and gone. We had our new supplies, of course, and a stack of letters bound together with twine. Thomas sorted through them with practiced hands, handing out the missives with a quiet efficiency. I remember how his face changed, just a flicker, as he looked at mine. "Bad news, I'm afraid, old man," he'd said, his voice unusually subdued. He extended the letter, and my hands trembled slightly as I took it. It was from my sister Martha. Her familiar looping handwriting was a small comfort, but the weight of the letter in my hand felt like a stone. It was about my wife, Sarah. She had passed away, peacefully, in her sleep. The letter said, an ailment of the heart that she had struggled with for years had finally taken its toll. The words swam before my eyes. Sarah, gone. The lighthouse, usually a sanctuary, suddenly felt like a prison. The walls seemed to close in, the rhythmic sweep of the light, a mocking reminder of the relentless passage of time, a time she would no longer share. I sank onto my bunk, the letter clutched in my hand, the silence of the tower amplifying the grief that threatened to overwhelm me. I'd known, of course, that this day might come. Sarah had been frail for years, but knowing and feeling were two very different things. The knowledge had been a distant cloud on the horizon. The feeling was a storm crashing over me. Thomas and James, bless their souls, knew enough to leave me alone for a while. They took over my watch, tended to the light, and moved around me with a quiet respect that spoke volumes. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, the crushing weight of isolation in times like these. Back home, I would have been surrounded by family and friends, sharing stories, offering comfort, finding solace in shared memories. Here there was only the sea, the sky, and the unblinking eye of the light. Later that day, Thomas came to my bunk. He sat beside me, not saying anything for a long moment. He was never one for empty platitudes. He understood the futility of trying to lessen grief. "We'll say a prayer tonight," After supper, he said finally, his voice low and steady. For Sarah and for you. That night, as the lamp cast long, dancing shadows on the walls of the lantern room, we gathered together. The wind howled outside, a mournful symphony that seemed to echo my own sorrow. Thomas read a passage from the Bible, his voice resonating in the small space. James, usually gruff and taciturn, stood with his head bowed, his calloused hands clasped in front of him. It wasn't the same as a proper service, of course. There was no choir, no stained glass, no familiar faces, but there was something profoundly comforting in the shared silence, in the unspoken bond between us. We were three men, isolated on a rock in the middle of the ocean, bound together by duty, and now by shared grief. The days that followed were a blur. The routine continued, a necessary anchor in the storm of my emotions. I performed my duties mechanically, my thoughts constantly drifting back to Sarah, to our life together, to the memories that now felt both precious and unbearably painful. Sleep offered little respite. Dreams were filled with her laughter, her touch, the warmth of her presence. I would wake with a start, the reality of her absence crashing down on me anew. One evening, I found myself drawn to the logbook. It was a thick, leather-bound volume, filled with the meticulous entries of generations of keepers. I flipped through the pages, my fingers tracing the faded ink. Names and dates, weather reports, notes on passing ships, the mundane details of a life lived in service to the light. Then, I found an entry that caught my eye. It was written by a keeper named Elias. Many years ago, he had lost his son to a fever, and his entry was a raw, unfiltered expression of grief. He wrote about the emptiness, the despair, the feeling that life had lost all meaning. But he also wrote about the light, about the responsibility he felt to keep it burning, to guide ships safely through the darkness. He wrote about finding solace in his duty, in the knowledge that he was making a difference, even in the face of personal tragedy. His words resonated with me. I wasn't alone in my grief. Others had stood on this very spot, facing similar losses, finding the strength to carry on. The light, a symbol of hope and guidance, had also been a beacon for them, a reminder of the importance of their task. It didn't erase the pain, of course. Nothing could do that. But it offered a glimmer of hope, a sense of connection to something larger than myself. It reminded me that even in the darkest of times, there was still a purpose, a reason to keep going. Slowly, gradually, the sharp edges of grief began to soften. The routine, the duty, the unwavering support of my fellow keepers, they were my anchors in the storm. I knew that Sarah would never be forgotten. Her memory would live on in my heart, a guiding light in its own way. And as long as I kept the light burning, I would honor her life and the love we shared. The sea may have taken her from me, but it could never take away the memories. And in this lonely tower, surrounded by the vast and unforgiving ocean, those memories were all I had left. And for now, that would have to be enough. The rhythm of the sea, the constant sweep of the beat, it could lull you into a false sense of security, you know? Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, and the work became almost hypnotic. But the ocean, she's a fickle mistress. She'll test you. She'll remind you that you're never truly in control. We'd seen our share of rough weather, of course. Gales that rattled the lighthouse to its core. Waves that crashed against the lantern room windows, like angry fists. But nothing quite prepared us for the night. The light almost died. It started with the fog, a thick, cloying fog that rolled in off the Atlantic like a shroud. Visibility dropped to near zero. You could barely see the hand in front of your face, let alone the treacherous rocks that surrounded the island. We'd lit the lamp, naturally, the moment the fog bank began to thicken. The first-order Fresnel lens, a marvel of engineering, was doing its job, cutting through the gloom with its powerful beam. Or so we thought. Thomas was on watch that night. He was diligent, that lad, always taking his responsibilities seriously. But even the most diligent can be caught off guard. It was around 2 in the morning when he noticed it. A flicker. Just a momentary dimming of the light, almost imperceptible. He dismissed it at first, perhaps just a trick of the eye, brought on by fatigue. But then it happened again, and again. Each time the flicker seemed a little longer, a little more pronounced. Alarm bells started ringing in his head. He knew what a malfunctioning light meant in conditions like these. It meant ships, relying on that steady beacon to guide them through the treacherous waters, would be sailing blind. It meant potential disaster. He roused Mr. Davies and myself from our bunks. The old man grumbled something about needing his sleep, but the urgency in Thomas's voice must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation. We hurried up the winding staircase to the lantern room, the cold, damp air clinging to our skin. What we found confirmed Thomas's fears. The lamp, the heart of the entire operation, was sputtering erratically. The mantle, a delicate mesh of fabric that glowed with intense brightness when heated by the oil vapor, was flickering wildly, threatening to extinguish altogether. The pressures dropping, Mr. Davies shouted over the roar of the wind and the rhythmic hiss of the lamp. He fiddled with the valves, trying to regulate the flow of oil, but to no avail. The pressure continued to plummet. We knew the likely culprit, a blockage in the oil feed. Some sediment perhaps, or a buildup of residue, had choked the flow of fuel to the burner. It was a common enough problem, but one that needed to be addressed immediately. In normal conditions, it would have been a relatively straightforward task, but with the fog as thick as pea soup and ships potentially heading our way, time was of the essence. "We need to clear the blockage," I said, my voice tight with urgency. "Davies, you stay here and try to keep the lamp going for as long as you can. Thomas, help me get the spare burner ready." We scrambled to action. The spare burner was stored in a small compartment next to the lantern room. It was heavy, cumbersome, and covered in a thin layer of grease and dust. We wrestled it out of its storage space and began the process of connecting it to the oil feed. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The sputtering of the lamp grew more erratic, the light dimming further with each passing second. We could hear Mr. Davies cursing under his breath as he fought to keep it alive. "Almost there," I muttered, tightening the last connection on the spare burner. My hands were shaking with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. We knew that if the light went out completely, even for a few minutes, it could have catastrophic consequences. Finally, after what seemed like an age, we were ready. We exchanged a quick glance, a silent acknowledgement of the gravity of the situation. I signaled to Mr. Davies to shut off the old burner. He hesitated for a moment, his eyes filled with doubt. "Are you sure about this?" he asked. "If we lose the light, we have no choice," I replied, my voice firm. "It's going to go out anyway. We need to try the spare." With a deep breath, he reached out and turned the valve. The sputtering of the old burner ceased abruptly, plunging the lantern room into near darkness. The only light came from our lanterns, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. For a moment, there was an eerie silence, broken only by the howling of the wind and the crashing of the waves against the rocks below. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Then, with a hiss and a roar, the spare burner ignited. A brilliant white light filled the lantern room, even brighter than before. We had done it. We had managed to avert disaster, at least for now. We stood there for a moment, catching our breath, the adrenaline slowly beginning to subside. The relief was palpable. We had cheated death, not just for ourselves, but potentially for countless others out on the water. But we knew our work wasn't done. We still had to clear the blockage in the old burner, and that meant a long and arduous cleaning process. We worked through the rest of the night, our bodies aching, our eyes burning, but our spirits buoyed by the knowledge that we had done our duty. As the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the fog, we finally managed to get the old burner working again. We reinstalled it, checked all the connections, and breathed a collective sigh of relief. The light was strong, steady, and reliable once more. The fog eventually lifted, revealing a calm and peaceful sea. But we knew that beneath that serene surface, the ocean was always lurking, waiting for its chance to test us again, and we knew that we had to be ready, always vigilant, always prepared to face whatever challenges she might throw our way, because that, we understood, was the life of a lighthouse keeper. It was a life of routine, of monotony, but it was also a life of responsibility, of courage, and of unwavering dedication to keeping the light burning bright. The waves crashed against the lantern room, a constant rhythmic reminder of our isolation. Christmas was approaching, or at least December was. Out here, adrift in the vastness of the ocean, time lost some of its meaning. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, marked only by the changing tides and the occasional supply ship. But even in the most desolate of places, the human spirit yearns for connection, for tradition, for a sense of belonging. And so we decided to celebrate, to acknowledge the holiday season in our own peculiar way. Now, celebrate might be too strong a word. Our resources were, shall we say, limited. There were no sparkling trees, no overflowing feasts, no carols echoing through the halls, just 3 men, a lonely lighthouse, and a handful of memories of better times. Thomas, bless his heart, was the most enthusiastic, still relatively new to the life. He clung to the hope of normalcy with a youthful fervor. He'd been hoarding bits of driftwood, carefully selecting pieces that resembled, if you squinted just right, a miniature tree. We could decorate it with shells, he suggested, his eyes bright, and maybe some of the shiny paper from the ration packages. Old man Hemlock, ever the pragmatist, grumbled, "Shiny paper is for wrapping around the herring, not for fancies, and those shells attract spiders, lad." But even Hemlock, I noticed, didn't entirely dismiss the idea. He just liked to complain. It was his way of feeling alive, I think. I was somewhere in the middle, weary after years of service, but also understanding the need for a little light in the darkness. So we set to work. Thomas, with boundless energy, meticulously arranged his driftwood tree, securing it with bits of twine, salvaged from old ropes. I helped him gather the smoothest, most colorful shells we could find. They weren't exactly ornaments, but they were something. Hemlock, meanwhile, begrudgingly contributed. He pulled out a small tarnished silver locket from his trunk, a relic from his own past. He never spoke about it, but I caught the way his eyes lingered on it, as he carefully hung it on one of the branches. It was a silent offering, a glimpse into a life he rarely shared. Our decorations were simple, almost pathetic. A few painted shells, the silver locket, strips of shimmering paper reflecting the light of the lamp. But they were enough. They transformed the starkness of the living quarters, adding a touch of warmth, a flicker of hope. The food was another challenge. The Christmas goose, the plum pudding, the mince pies, those were distant memories. Our festive meal consisted of salted beef, hardtack biscuits, and a meager portion of dried apples. But Thomas again worked his magic. He'd been experimenting with baking, using the small stove in the kitchen. He managed to whip up a sort of cake out of crushed biscuits, dried fruit, and a generous helping of molasses. It was dense, sticky, and probably terrible for our teeth, but it tasted like Christmas, or at least it tasted like a valiant attempt at Christmas. We ate our meager feast in silence, the only sound the relentless roar of the ocean. We didn't exchange gifts, we didn't sing carols, but we shared something more profound, a shared experience, a silent acknowledgement of our shared humanity. After dinner, we gathered around the small table, the flickering candlelight casting long dancing shadows on the walls. Hemlock, surprisingly, pulled out his harmonica. It was old and battered, but still capable of producing a mournful, haunting melody. He played old sea shanties, tunes that spoke of shipwrecks and lost loves, of faraway lands and the call of the sea. Thomas and I listened in silence, the music filling the void, bridging the gap between our disparate lives. Later that night, as I stood watch in the lantern room, the beam of light cutting through the darkness, I thought about the people back home, about families gathered around warm fires, exchanging gifts and laughter. I felt a pang of longing, a sharp ache of loneliness. But then I looked out at the vast star-studded sky, and I felt a strange sense of peace. We were out here, keeping watch, protecting those at sea. We were a small, insignificant part of a larger world, but we were doing our duty. And even in the midst of isolation, we had found a way to connect, to celebrate, to remind ourselves that we were still human. The holiday season on a lonely lighthouse wasn't about presents or feasts or festive cheer. It was about resilience, about finding joy in the simplest of things, about remembering the ties that bind us, even when we're separated by miles of ocean. It was about creating our own little spark of light in the face of overwhelming darkness. And maybe, just maybe, that was the true spirit of Christmas, or New Year's, or whatever holiday found us stuck on that rock. A small act of defiance against the loneliness, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. And as I watched the beam of light sweep across the horizon, I knew that we would make it through another year, another storm, another long, lonely night. Because even in the darkest of places, hope can always find a way to shine, just like our little makeshift celebration, a beacon against the void, a quiet affirmation that even out here, adrift in the immensity of the ocean, we were not forgotten, and neither were the holidays, the endless horizon. It's beautiful, isn't it? Breathtaking even. But after a while, staring at the same unbroken line where the sea meets the sky, it starts to feel less like freedom and more like a cage. A very large, very wet cage. And that cage, it has a funny way of reflecting things back at you. Things you'd rather not see. Out here, with only the rhythmic pulse of the lamp and the ever-present roar of the ocean, there's no place to hide from yourself. Back on the mainland, you can lose yourself in the bustle of the town, the chatter of the pub, the comfort of a familiar face. But here it's just you, the other keepers, and the unblinking eye of the lighthouse. For me, well, the lighthouse started showing me things I'd kept buried for a long time. Doubts, regrets, the ever-gnawing feeling that I wasn't enough. I remember my father, a strong, silent man, a man of the land. He expected me to follow in his footsteps, to till the soil, to build a life from the earth. But I felt drawn to the sea, a yearning he couldn't understand. And I think deep down, he never forgave me for it. Did he think I was running away from hard work? Was I? The work here is hard, no doubt, but it's different. It's solitary, and that solitude, it amplifies those old insecurities. The thought creeps in, am I proving him right? Am I wasting my life tending to a lamp, isolated and alone? Was I wrong to abandon my family farm? Am I good for anything? The storms don't help, either. The way the wind howls, the waves crash against the rocks, it feels like the world is trying to swallow you whole. And in those moments, you can't help but wonder if it wouldn't be easier to just give in, let the darkness take you, to be lost in the sea and to be absolved of all failures. There was one particularly rough night. A gale was raging, the strongest I'd seen yet. The lighthouse shuddered and groaned under the assault. I was up in the lantern room, fighting to keep the lamp burning, when a rogue wave crashed against the tower, sending a shockwave through the entire structure. The light flickered, threatened to go out, and in that moment, I panicked. I felt a wave of pure, unadulterated fear wash over me. Not fear of the storm, not fear of the lighthouse collapsing, but fear of failure. What if I couldn't keep the light going? What if a ship crashed on the rocks because of me? The weight of responsibility, the potential for disaster, it was crushing. I clung to the lamp, my knuckles white, my heart pounding in my chest. And as I struggled to reignite the flame, I realized something. This fear, it wasn't new. It had been with me my whole life. The fear of disappointing my father, the fear of not measuring up, the fear of being insignificant. The lighthouse, in its own harsh way, was forcing me to confront it. It wasn't just the physical isolation. It was the isolation from distraction, from the comforting lies we tell ourselves to get through the day. Out here, there's no room for self-deception. The truth stares you in the face, reflected in the cold, unforgiving light. That night, battling the storm and my own inner demons, I made a choice. I couldn't change the past. I couldn't erase my father's disapproval, but I could choose how I reacted to it. I could choose to let fear paralyze me, or I could choose to fight. I focused on the task at hand, on keeping the lamp burning, on guiding ships safely through the night. And as the storm raged on, I felt a strange sense of calm descend over me. I was still afraid, yes, but I was also determined to prove myself, not to my father, but to myself. Determined to be the keeper this light needed me to be. It wasn't easy. There were many more nights filled with doubt and anxiety, but with each passing storm, with each successful navigation, I grew a little stronger. I started to see the lighthouse not as a prison, but as a crucible, a place where I could forge myself anew. The ocean, it still reflects my fears, my insecurities. But now, when I look at it, I also see something else. I see resilience. I see the strength I never knew I possessed. I am a lighthouse keeper, and I am more than just a keeper of the light. I am a keeper of my own soul, and I will not let the darkness extinguish it. The weight of the past doesn't disappear completely, but it gets lighter with each sunrise. This solitary life, it still brings on waves of doubt, but I see how important it is to keep that light shining. Maybe my father wouldn't understand, and maybe he still wouldn't approve, but I can now stand alone in knowing I'm doing what I'm meant to do. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. The rhythmic pulse of the lamp. For so long it was the only constant. Days bled into weeks into months, illuminated by that unwavering beat. It was a comfort, a duty, a promise kept. But even promises, even duties, can be threatened by the relentless march of progress. And that's exactly what started to happen. It began subtly. Whispers carried on the supply ships, rumors rustling like the wind through the lantern room. At first we dismissed them as idle chatter, the kind of tall tales sailors spin to fill the long hours at sea. But the whispers persisted, grew louder, more insistent. And the word that kept coming back, that settled like a stone in the pit of your stomach, was automation. Automation. A grand word, promising efficiency and advancement. But to us here on this lonely rock, it sounded more like a death knell. You see, we understood the light. We knew its quirks, its needs. We coaxed it to life each evening, nursed it through storms, and swore we could almost hear its gratitude in the steady hum. Could a machine truly understand that? Could it feel the weight of responsibility, the quiet satisfaction of knowing you were guiding ships safely through the night? The newspapers, when they finally arrived weeks late, confirmed our fears. Articles detailing the invention of new self-operating lights, machines that could wind themselves, trim their own wicks, and even signal for help automatically. Ingenious contraptions, they called them. Labor-saving devices. They even mentioned increased efficiency, reducing costs, but it did not reduce our stress. Old man Hemlock, bless his soul, took it the hardest. He'd spent over 30 years tending to the lamp, man and boy. It was all he knew. He'd seen keepers come and go, storms rage and subside, but the light was his anchor, his purpose. He'd often say, "The light is a living thing, Thomas. It needs a hand, a heart to keep it burning bright." He started spending even more time in the lantern room, polishing the lens until it gleamed like a star, meticulously cleaning every nook and cranny of the machinery. Almost as if by cleaning it more and more, the light would be less likely to be replaced. We caught him talking to the lamp sometimes, whispering old sea shanty and tales of his youth. It was heartbreaking. Young Finn, always the optimist, tried to put a brave face on it. "Maybe it won't be so bad," he'd say, trying to get us to lighten up a bit. "Maybe we'll get transferred to a bigger station, closer to the mainland. Maybe we can see our families more often." But even his voice lacked its usual conviction. He knew, deep down, that automation wasn't about better postings, but about eliminating them altogether. The uncertainty was the worst part. We didn't know when or how the change would come. Would they simply arrive one day with a team of engineers and dismantle the lamp before our very eyes? Would we be given notice, a chance to say goodbye, or would we simply be replaced, our services no longer required? It was a question which ran through all our minds. What was going to happen to us? The work continued, of course. The light still needed tending. The logbook still needed filling. We still had to climb the stairs, clean the lens, and keep watch. But there was a new weight to our movements, a heaviness in the air. The rhythmic pulse of the lamp, once a source of comfort, now seemed to mock us, a constant reminder of our impending obsolescence. The thought of the ships being guided safely by a machine was not one that filled me with confidence. It filled me with fear. We started hoarding supplies, extra oil, extra wicks, anything we could get our hands on. It wasn't out of greed, but fear. Fear of being left adrift, without a trade, without a purpose. We even started fishing more, salting and drying the catch, in case our rations were cut. We were starting to look at ourselves as a machine, and not as keepers. The camaraderie, which had once been our strength, began to fray. We became more withdrawn, more suspicious. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, fueled by the underlying anxiety. We were like rats in a cage, knowing the trap was about to spring shut. I started dreaming about the light, not the real light, but a mechanical one, a cold, unfeeling contraption that cast a harsh, sterile beam. In my dream, the machine malfunctioned, its gears grinding to a halt, and the ships, lost and confused, crashed against the rocks. I woke up in a cold sweat, the sound of the waves pounding against the shore, echoing my own fear. The lamp, it became a symbol of everything we were about to lose. Our livelihood, our purpose, our connection to the sea. It was more than just a light, it was our identity. And the thought of it being replaced by a machine, well, it was enough to break a man's spirit. We all had to figure out how we were going to make the most of our situation. It was something that weighed heavily on us all. The future was ahead, and we were getting closer to it, whether we wanted to or not. The North Atlantic, relentless, unforgiving. We've seen Thomas and his fellow keepers battle its storms, endure its isolation, and witness its power. But sometimes, the sea demands more than just endurance. Sometimes it demands a sacrifice, and in this instance, it demanded courage beyond measure. It was late autumn, the tail end of the storm season, but the ocean remained restless, unpredictable. A thick fog, the kind that clings to the skin and muffles every sound, had rolled in days before. The foghorn blared its mournful song every few minutes, a desperate plea for ships to steer clear of the treacherous rocks surrounding the island. Inside the lantern room, the air was thick with humidity. Thomas, seasoned by now, meticulously polished a section of the lens, his movements practiced, almost meditative. Old man Hemlock, usually jovial, paced nervously, his weathered face etched with worry. Finnegan, ever the pragmatist, checked the oil levels in the lamp, his movements economical and precise.
"She's a pea super out there," Hemlock muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "A ship could be right on top of us before we even knew it." His words proved prophetic. Suddenly, a sound cut through the foghorn's drone, a desperate, high-pitched whistle, followed by the sickening crunch of metal against rock. Silence. Then, a chorus of panicked shouts, barely audible through the fog. The keepers exchanged horrified glances. A ship had run aground, and it was close, too close. "Finnegan, the signal flares," Hemlock barked, his voice suddenly sharp and authoritative. "Thomas, with me, we need to see what we're dealing with." They raced down the winding stairs, the urgency of the moment eclipsing the usual weariness of their bodies. Emerging into the fog, the air was thick with the smell of salt and burning oil.
The cries for help were clearer now, laced with terror. Groping their way towards the sound, they reached the edge of the island, the waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks. Through the swirling mist, they saw it, a small fishing vessel, its hull ripped open, precariously perched on a submerged reef. Men clung desperately to the wreckage, their faces pale and gaunt. The waves threatened to pull them under at any moment. "We need to get them off there," Thomas shouted, his voice barely audible above the roar of the sea. "The lifeboat's too heavy to launch in this surf." Finnegan yelled back, struggling to light a flare. "We'd never get close enough." Hemlock surveyed the scene, his brow furrowed in concentration. Time was running out. The ship was breaking apart, and the men wouldn't last long in the frigid water. "There's one way," he said, his voice grim. "The rope." He pointed to a thick hawser that ran from the lighthouse down to a small rocky outcrop closer to the wreck. It was used for hauling supplies in calm weather, but it was strong. "I can climb down there, secure the rope to the wreck, and they can use it to get to shore," Hemlock explained. "But it's treacherous. The rocks are slick with seaweed, and one wrong step." He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew the danger. "I'll go with you," Thomas offered, his heart pounding in his chest. "No," Hemlock said firmly. "You stay here and manage the line. Finnegan, keep those flares coming. We need to keep them visible." There was no time for argument. Hemlock, despite his age and the obvious risk, was already moving, securing a safety line around his waist. With a deep breath, he began his descent. It was a slow, agonizing process. The fog made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The waves crashed against the rocks, sending plumes of spray into the air. Hemlock moved with the caution of a mountain goat, his hands gripping the rope with a strength that belied his age. Thomas and Finnegan watched from above, their hearts in their throats. Every crash of a wave, every gust of wind, threatened to dislodge Hemlock from his precarious perch. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he reached the outcrop. He secured the rope to a jagged piece of metal on the wreck, his movements slow and deliberate. "Rope secure," he yelled, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "Send them across." One by one, the men on the wreck began to make their way along the rope, inching their way towards safety. It was a terrifying sight. Some were strong, others weak and injured. All were terrified. Thomas and Finnegan pulled on the rope, guiding them towards the shore, their muscles burning with the strain. Each rescued man was a victory, a small glimmer of hope in the face of tragedy. But then disaster struck. A particularly large wave crashed against the rocks, sweeping over the outcrop and engulfing Hemlock in a torrent of water. The rope went slack. "Hemlock!" Thomas screamed, his voice filled with dread. For a moment there was nothing but the roar of the ocean. Then, through the swirling mist, they saw him clinging to a piece of wreckage, being tossed about like a rag doll. Without hesitation, Thomas acted. He secured himself to the remaining length of the hawser and began to climb down, defying the storm and his own fear. Finnegan watched in disbelief, yelling at Thomas to come back, but his words were lost in the wind. Thomas pressed on, driven by a desperate need to save his fellow keeper. Reaching the outcrop, he fought his way through the churning water and grabbed Hemlock, who was barely conscious. The older man's face was pale, his eyes glazed over. "Hold on," Thomas shouted, his voice strained. "I've got you." With Herculean effort, he pulled Hemlock back onto the outcrop and secured him to the rope. Then, signaling to Finnegan, they began to haul him back to safety. It was a grueling struggle, but finally, they managed to pull Hemlock back to the lighthouse, exhausted and battered, but alive. The remaining survivors from the wreck were rescued soon after, their faces etched with gratitude. They huddled together, shivering and exhausted, but safe. "They're safe." Hemlock spent several days recovering, his body bruised and battered, but his spirit unbroken.
He had risked his life to save others, and his courage had inspired Thomas to do the same. In the days that followed, the story of their bravery spread along the coast, a testament to the unwavering dedication and selfless courage of the lighthouse keepers. It was a reminder that even in the most isolated and dangerous places, heroism could be found, and that sometimes the greatest light shines not from the lamp, but from the hearts of those who keep it burning. The rhythmic sweep of the lamp, a steady pulse in the inky blackness, it had become almost a part of me. For years it had been my companion, my responsibility, my life. But lately, that comforting rhythm had started to sound more like a ticking clock. And what, I wondered, was it counting down to? I sat there, the logbook open before me, the faint scent of salt and old paper filling my nostrils. Another entry completed, another watch kept, another day blurring into the next. The ocean, magnificent and terrifying, stretched out beyond the glass, a constant reminder of both the beauty and the unforgiving nature of the world. I remembered the day I arrived here, fresh-faced and eager, filled with romantic notions of heroism and solitude. The reality, of course, had been a little different. Solitude there was, in abundance. Heroism, well, that was mostly about preventing disaster, not actively fighting it. It was a silent, unseen heroism, appreciated only when it wasn't needed. And romance, that had faded with the salty spray and the endless horizon. My fingers traced the faded ink of previous keepers' entries. Men like me, each with their own stories, their own hopes, their own regrets. I wondered how many had dreamt of escape, of a different life, only to be swallowed by the routine, by the relentless turning of the lamp. The letters from Mary back home, they were growing thinner, less frequent. The joy had dimmed, the details more mundane. How could I blame her? Life in Penzance continued, while my days were marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing tides. How could a life so constant hope to compete with a life in motion? A wave crashed against the rocks below, rattling the very foundations of the tower. It was a stark reminder of my vulnerability, of the island's isolation. Here, the world felt distant. News arrived weeks late, carried by infrequent supply ships. I knew about the war brewing in Europe only through snippets, second-hand accounts. It felt like watching a play through a keyhole, vivid but unreal. I thought of father. He'd always wanted me to take over the family farm. Solid, reliable work, close to family. Dismissed it back then, yearning for adventure. Now the image of the green fields, the smell of earth, the comforting presence of familiar faces. It felt like a forgotten paradise. But the lighthouse, it was more than just a job. It was a purpose, to guide ships safely through treacherous waters, to be a beacon of hope in the darkest night. I knew I was good at it. I was reliable. I was needed. Countless lives had depended, and would depend on the steady beam I helped maintain. And then there were Finn and Old Man Silas, my fellow keepers. We weren't friends, not exactly, but we were bound by this shared existence, this solitary duty. We argued, we bickered, but we depended on each other. Leaving would mean leaving them short-handed, burdening them with extra work. The money was good, better than farm work, certainly. I'd saved enough to buy a small cottage, maybe even start a family, but money couldn't buy happiness, not out here. It couldn't buy conversation with someone you loved, not real connection. I stood up, stretching my stiff limbs. The wind howled outside, a mournful song that echoed the turmoil in my own heart. What kind of life was this, really? A life lived in isolation, dedicated to a machine. A life where the only companions were the endless sea and the mournful cries of the gulls. Was it enough? I looked at the lamp again, its steady beam cutting through the darkness. It was a powerful symbol, but also a potent prison. I could stay, continue the routine, grow old in this tower, becoming another faded name in the logbook. Or I could choose something different. I could choose to leave this lighthouse, this island, this life,
behind. The thought scared me. It scared me more than any storm, more than any tale of shipwrecks. To leave was to admit that I'd been wrong, that I'd wasted years of my life. It was to face the uncertainty of the world, to risk failure, to confront the unknown. But it was also a chance for happiness, for connection, for a life lived fully, not just observed from the confines of a lonely tower. The wind seemed to soften, the lamp's beam to grow a little brighter. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to chart a new course, a course that led not to the predictable rhythm of the light, but to the unpredictable and ultimately more rewarding shores of life. With trembling hands, I closed the logbook. The decision was made, and so years passed. Seasons blurred, storms raged and then subsided. The rhythm of the light became the rhythm of my life. The turning lens, the sweeping beam, a comforting metronome in the vast silence of the sea. The isolation, once a daunting prospect, mellowed into a strange kind of peace. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much I've changed. That nervous green lad who first stepped off the supply ship, he barely resembles the man I am now. The sea has a way of stripping away the unnecessary, leaving only what's essential. It teaches patience, resilience, and a profound respect for the power of nature. And it forces you to confront yourself, to face the quiet whispers that echo in the stillness of the night. There were hard times, of course. The gnawing loneliness, the constant worry about the light, the fear of failure. The days when the storms howled relentlessly and the waves crashed against the tower, threatening to swallow us whole. The times when illness struck and we were miles from any help, relying on each other's limited knowledge and desperate hope. And the news from home, sometimes the news from home was the hardest thing of all. Learning of losses, of changes, of lives moving on without you, knowing you were missing out, watching from afar. But there were also moments of profound beauty. The breathtaking sunsets that painted the sky in hues of orange and purple. The sight of a pod of whales breaching in the distance, the camaraderie between the keepers, forged in the crucible of shared experience, the satisfaction of knowing that you were playing a vital role, guiding ships safely through treacherous waters, that you were a beacon of hope in the darkness. I remember one particularly fierce storm. The wind was screaming, the waves were mountainous, and the light was flickering. A broken gear threatened to plunge the entire coast into darkness. We fought for hours, battling the elements, our bodies aching, our spirits flagging. Just when we thought we were defeated, young Elias, barely a man, found a solution. A makeshift repair using scraps of metal and sheer ingenuity. He saved the light that night, and he saved countless lives, I'm sure of it. And that's the legacy of the light, isn't it? Not just the physical structure, the stone and glass, but the knowledge, the dedication, the unwavering commitment to duty. It's a legacy passed down from keeper to keeper, generation after generation. A responsibility we bear to those who came before us and to those who will come after. Now I'm getting on in years, my bones ache in the damp, and my eyesight isn't what it used to be. It's time for me to pass on the torch, to entrust the light to younger hands. And young Samuel, he reminds me of myself all those years ago, eager, a little nervous, but with a good heart and a willingness to learn. I've shown him everything I know, how to clean the lens until it gleams like 1,000 suns, how to maintain the lamp, ensuring it burns bright and true, how to read the charts, to understand the currents, to anticipate the weather, how to listen to the sea, to feel its rhythm, to respect its power. And most importantly, I've taught him the importance of vigilance, of unwavering attention to detail. A moment's lapse can have devastating consequences. I've shared stories from the logbooks, tales of shipwrecks and rescues, of storms and calm sea, stories of the men who came before, their lives, their sacrifices, their unwavering dedication.
I want him to understand that he's not just turning a key and polishing glass. He's part of something bigger, something important, something that connects him to a long and proud tradition. I told him about the time I saw a ghost ship sailing through the fog. An old three-master, its sails tattered, its deck empty, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk beneath the surface. He laughed, of course, but I saw a flicker of apprehension in his eyes. The sea has its mysteries, and it's best to treat them with respect. And I told him about Amelia, the woman I left behind, the woman I wrote to every week, the woman whose letters kept me going through the darkest nights. He's young and full of hope, and I didn't want to burden him with my regrets. But I wanted him to understand that life is about more than just duty. It's about love and connection and finding meaning in the midst of isolation. He'll make mistakes, of course. We all do, but he'll learn from them. He'll grow stronger, more resilient, more capable, and one day he'll pass on the light to the next generation, and so the cycle will continue. The light will shine on, guiding ships safely through the darkness, a testament to the enduring power of human dedication.
That's all any of us can hope for, isn't it? To leave the world a little brighter than we found it, to make a difference however small, to be a beacon of hope in the darkness, to leave a legacy that will endure long after we're gone. And as I prepare to leave this island, to return to the mainland, to a life I can barely imagine, I know that I've done my part. I've kept the light burning, and I've passed on the knowledge to those who will come after me. And that, I think, is a life well lived.